Okay, and thank you for joining us. And this is being brought to you by our sponsors, Students Union Australia and Politics Reloaded. And we're streaming on Facebook and YouTube. And I'm just going to change some views. And the recordings will be available on these platforms after the event. So, gun bans, reclassifications, and new laws for shooters. Concocted reasons for buybacks, high fees, and contempt. Whenever governments talk about bringing in tough new gun laws, it's because they want to look proactive in the media against an invisible enemy. So they make laws that affect us and not criminals. And it doesn't matter to them either. These problems are manifesting themselves in different ways in the states and territories, making this fight a national problem. This conference will explore what's happening and what we can do about it, and you'll hear from industry leaders and political parties on topics that cross these boundaries, and will help pave the way to fight for better gun laws and better treatment of us by politicians. And look, Australia has, sorry, I was just moving some presenters around. Australia has something like 700,000, 800,000, 900,000, however many licensed shooters. And the clear majority of them feel the same way that you do about what's happening to us. Now, this conference is not only Australia-wide, but it has been set up to cross organisational boundaries. Now, there's something like over 90 shooting organisations with around 1,000 ranges and clubs Australia-wide. It's also a multi-billion-dollar industry supported by gun-related businesses who feel the same way. It's our aim to grow this conference into a much bigger annual event for everyone who wants to see something done to address the problems we're facing. So the agenda for today, which I shall put up again for you. So I've just given you the introduction to today's event. And we're going to be covering some key topics with speakers being from the political sphere, former Senators David Leyonhjelm and Nigel Scullion. And we're also going to be hearing from David Brown, who's the National Vice President for Shooters Union, and Tom Kenyon, who is the CEO for the SSAA National. Then we'll be hearing from Nick Demetto, who's from the Canada's Australia Party. It's a pre-recorded presentation. I'll be talking about a commitment that's coming out of the Northern Territory. Now, bear in mind that Northern Territory is one of 4 states or territories having elections this year. So we'll be covering the Northern Territory, we'll be covering Queensland. The other 2 elections that the one that's passed us is the Tasmanian state election. That was brought forward by a year. We've also got one in the ACT. And then we'll be hearing from Bridget McKenzie, who's a senator with the Nationals, on how shooters can improve their political outlook. And then we'll be hearing from the Western Australian Libertarians, who, of course, Western Australia, as you know, has had quite a problem in the last couple of years with the rewrite of the Firearms Act over there, and they're coming up for their own state election in March next year. Oops, sorry, I had to move forward with the slides there. I was watching that. So the first speaker is David Leyonhjelm. So David has been involved in politics since the 1970s. He is a long-standing sporting shooter and author of 2 books, one of them on gun control, and there's another one on its way. Now, David was elected to the Senate representing New South Wales at the 2013 election, commencing his term in 2014, and he resigned in 2019. In Parliament, David fought the Adler ban, delaying it for a year alongside others. He also succeeded in securing a 25-year lease on the Malabar Rifle Range in New South Wales. And you can follow David on Twitter or X at David Leyonhjelm. So I'm going to just stop that presentation, and we're going to throw to Dave. And bear with me, Dave. I'm just going to... The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Leyonhjelm. I was as Neil said, I was in the Senate for 5 years. but I'm no longer a senator, so there's nothing quite as ex as being an ex-senator. But the firearms issue is still close to my heart. One of the reasons for that is that Australians today face unprecedented levels of gun control. In the history of this country, the restrictions on firearm ownership and use have never been so broad or so restrictive. Now, the purpose of today's conference is to consider why that is the case and what might be done about it. We're not here primarily to argue the case, though. Those involved in this conference, those listening, are already on our side. There's no point preaching to them. Our problem is that many people, perhaps even a majority of Australians, instinctively believe the case for gun control is so obvious that it needs no justification. Any report of gun deaths, whether it's murder or suicide, and certainly every multiple shooting, is sufficient to prompt a shaking of heads in disbelief that governments have failed to introduce adequate gun control. As they see it, proper gun control would bring an end to such events, resulting in a safer and kinder society. Some might interpret that as a longing for less violent crime, something that can be objectively measured. But in fact, few actually care about the facts. As far as actual crime is concerned, burglaries and car thefts are far more likely to bother them. What we're really talking about is perceptions, feelings, and it is only about guns. Murders in which other methods are used, such as knives or flammable liquids, rarely prompt demands for their control, irrespective of the number of casualties. In fact, for quite a lot of people, it's an obsession, arguably a psychological illness. The term hoplophobia is the term applied to it. And yet, as we all know, guns are inanimate objects with no minds of their own. They do not suddenly jump up and kill people, nor do they teleport homicidal thoughts into the minds of the people who own or use them. When pressed as to what specific gun control measures they believe would create a safer society, most people struggle. Of course, they will tell you a tough approach is important, but when it comes to details, they don't know. If you ask them to explain the current gun laws, almost none of them could do it. Never having owned a gun, they've never had to deal with the laws. If you ask them what additional measures do they believe would be effective, they rarely have any concrete suggestions. If they do, it's generally to suggest measures that are already in place. I've asked people that exact question on multiple occasions, and it is remarkable how often that occurs. When it's pointed out that Australia's gun laws made no difference to the rate of gun deaths or to the number of mass shootings, they reject the facts. That couldn't be right, they say. It doesn't feel right. Quite a lot of gun control advocates believe the solution is civilian disarmament. If guns are all banned, they say, they couldn't kill anyone. Make guns illegal, like drugs. But what, you might ask, should be done about the police and military? Should they also be disarmed? Most will say no, that those categories should continue to have guns. That means only the government will have guns. And when you ask, would you actually feel safer knowing that the only people with guns are the police and military, plus criminals, they get uncomfortable. Not when you put it that way. But then what about farmers and others who need to destroy sick or injured livestock? Wouldn't it be cruel if they couldn't have them? And what about security guards? Shouldn't cash, jewellery, or other valuables be protected? And of course, nobody has any answers when it comes to illegal guns. The government suggests there are a quarter of a million of those, but that's a very uninformed guess. In my book on gun control, I show why it could be around 3 million, perhaps more. The fact is, most of the opposition to gun ownership is irrational, based on ignorance and devoid of facts. For most people, their only knowledge of guns is what they've seen on television and in movies. As a result, they think anybody can just pick up a gun, pull the trigger and kill someone. They have no understanding of ammunition. As far as they know, any bullet will go in any gun. They have no idea about aiming, safety catches and triggers. In Australia, I guess less than 1 in 20 have ever fired a gun. They don't know what it feels like or sounds like. And there are many consequences of this ignorance. The vilification of the AR-15 is an example, although it's primarily in the United States because we can no longer have them. But if you try telling someone it's the equivalent of a Mini 14, they won't know what you're talking about. It's the same with suppressors. In the movies, suppressors are used by assassins and make guns virtually silent. They have simply no idea how loud guns normally are on the damage they can do to hearing. They have no idea that suppressors are a health and safety issue. They firmly believe suppressors are only used for sinister purposes and have no positive benefits. And of course, public servants, who are in fact primarily responsible for coming up with most government policies, not politicians most of the time, are no better informed. They share the same myths held by the general public. I've had public servants tell me they think it's positive to make it more and more difficult to own guns so people will give up. Somehow they think that's a good idea. The lack of knowledge of guns includes a lot of police. You see that whenever there is an incident involving a gun. Massive overreactions are typical. Those of us who know about guns laugh our heads off, but there's not many of us. What we are talking about is gun control based on feelings, not facts, on emotions, not reason. This is very much a 21st century phenomenon. Only this century was the law invoked to protect people from offence and hurt feelings. Previously, we did not hear demands for safe spaces, for freedom from microaggressions or from hate speech. It used to be that we didn't give offence, but we might choose to take it. These days, that is one of the key motivations for gun control. People simply do not like guns. When they say, "I'm afraid of guns" or "guns offend me," we can no longer tell them it's their problem and to get over it. Now it's our problem. What's not new is weapons control. Keeping certain weapons out of the hands of certain people has been a policy of governments for thousands of years. Sometimes it was intended to reduce crime, but far more often it was political. Back in the times of the Romans, which of course had endless political intrigues, certain types of swords were deemed unsuitable for civilians and were restricted to soldiers. In Elizabethan England, it was similar. Certain types of swords were regarded as only suitable for criminal purposes and were therefore prohibited, except that didn't apply to gentlemen, only the common people. And once guns were invented, this type of thinking became very common. In Australia, the first gun control laws were aimed at keeping guns out of the hands of Aborigines. In New Zealand, gun control laws were first introduced to prevent them from falling into the hands of Maoris. In America, slaves were of course not permitted to own guns. After the Civil War, state governments went to great lengths to prevent freed slaves from owning guns. Indeed, that lasted right up to the 1960s. But the history of gun control is not limited just to racism. It is also full of cases of the authorities being determined to prevent the people from threatening their power. For example, the first serious gun laws in Great Britain were in 1920 and aimed at preventing returned soldiers from gaining access to guns. Soldiers had been instrumental in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia just 3 years earlier, and rebellious soldiers played a significant role in civil strife in post-war Germany. The British government didn't want soldiers with ideas and guns getting involved in politics, hence the ban. Perhaps the most telling point is that every single genocide in the 20th century was preceded by or accompanied by harsh gun control. I'll just mention a few of the main ones. The massacre of the Armenians by the Turks, the gulags and forced starvation of Ukrainians and Russians by Stalin, the massacre of the Jews by the Nazis. Jews were specifically prohibited from owning guns. The arrest and elimination of political opponents by the nationalist Chinese government. The arrest and elimination of counter-revolutionary criminals in communist China. the massacre of Mayans in Guatemala, the massacre of Christians in Uganda, the killing fields of the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, and the massacre of the Tutsis by the Hutu in Rwanda. Everyone, without exception, was accompanied by tough gun control. The same tough gun control that people in our governments advocate, which they somehow want us to believe will make us safer. Gun control has long been mainly about control rather than guns. And in Australia, we are being subjected to more and more control. We took a massive loss in 1997 and 2002 with the Howard gun laws. A lot of rifles, pistols, and shotguns that were available in other countries, including the UK and New Zealand, we are not permitted to own rifles, shotguns, pistols. We can't even have semi-automatic rimfire rifles, which both New Zealand and the UK still allow. We can't carry anything for our own protection, not even a pocket knife. We're constantly harassed about safe storage and transport of firearms. We can't have plastic water squirters if they look like real prohibited guns. The Commonwealth Games are likely to drop shooting. Retaining shooting in the Olympics is a constant struggle. They are slowly but surely turning the screws on us. Even being in the Senate, as I was for 5 years, is not enough to turn the tide. I managed to secure a long-term lease for Malabar Rifle Range, but that was relatively uncontroversial. On lever-action shotguns, in other words, the Adler issue, the best I could do was delay the recategorisation for 12 months. It was very disheartening. And yet, no matter how much they torture the statistics, the evidence against guns never gets any stronger. There seems to be only two countries in the world, America and Australia. If we didn't have our gun laws, we'd be like America. No other alternative is admissible. The fact that the Czech Republic has gun laws similar to America and a lower murder rate than Australia is irrelevant. Most advocates couldn't find the country on a map. The fact that the state of Vermont in America has never had any gun laws and yet has a lower murder rate than Australia's, it's also irrelevant. Or that the cities and states with the toughest gun laws in America are also mostly where the worst gun violence occurs. Doesn't count. And if you take an international perspective and compare the toughness of gun laws with gun violence or murder rates, you find no correlation. Doesn't matter. All the evidence shows that gun laws and murder rates are independent variables. That is, they have no impact on each other. If you change one, you don't change the other. Doesn't count. If you could just get that recognised, though, if we could just get that recognised, though, things might change. But we are dealing, as I said, with ignorance and feelings. Speakers today will describe in more detail how the screws are turning. You will also hear various thoughts on what can be done to turn back the tide, what might be done to turn back the tide, what's worked in the past, and what might work in the future. We're not here to pretend we have the answers, but we think it's time to ask the right questions at least. We hope it leads to something that makes a difference. Thank you very much for your interest and your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And you're quite right, even water pistols are almost off, certainly a taboo. So this is really an opportunity now just to have a bit of a panel discussion. And I think in order to do that, I need to unmute people. So if there's anybody who would like to ask a question, make a comment.
Well, I'm going to pick up on one if I can, Neil.
Sure.
David just mentioned the crazy concept, and this is not one that I've actually used or honed in on before, but a very good discussion point, particularly in the political arena when we're talking about facts and data and keeping away from the emotion. The Australia-United States comparison, but we never look at, say, Switzerland or the Czech Republic. I mean, there is two classic examples whereby significant firearm ownership by the ordinary people does not result in mass murder, crime in the streets, all these sorts of problems. In fact, actually, there is less crime. And if you drill down into parts of the United States where regional USA, the crime is very, very low. You know, the Los Angeles, the Chicago's, etc., they blow the numbers right up. So that's something we don't talk about enough. And civilian firearm ownership does not equal madness, mayhem, and murder. And I would have to say, David, that was actually a very well stated point. It's always in the back of our mind, but we don't stop to talk about it much in the public arena and get that even published in the mainstream media. You know, why is it we say, oh, we don't want to be like America? Well, I actually think we want to be a lot like America, just parts of it, not the bad parts. So I don't think guns is the problem. There is in countries or even cities here in Australia where there, or parts of cities where there's problems. It's another problem. It's not the gun. It's not the cars. It's not the trucks. It's not the any other method of harming individuals, knives, fire. It's a cultural problem or it's a criminal problem, and I think we probably need to sort of expand the void between those two things so that people can't conflate them, I suppose, is probably the thing we should be aiming for in our discussions in the media and with politicians.
Okay, thank you for that. And yeah, I think you use the word culture. I think that goes right to the heart of a lot of our problems. And okay, look, I think we could probably move on now. The next topic, I'll have to pull up my point again. Is featuring David again, and it's actually elections on how to gain influence in politics. And David is the National Vice President of Shooters Union Australia. He has a background in mechanical engineering and aviation and is an instrument-rated pilot and engine management educator. David has been involved with Shooters Union since 2015 and has a particular focus on countering the damage caused by irrational gun extremists. And I think David Leyonhjelm used the word hoplophobe earlier on, and that's going to get another run a little bit later on. So we will go to you, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Neil. And if I was as well educated in the English, I was going to say the English sports, the English language, I probably would have a word like hoplophobe. But anyway, I'm going to kick off with something a little bit. I'm going to sort of be a little bit daredevilish. We're going to do some myth busting. So this is going to be not quite like the guys you would have seen on TV, but myth busting. The National Firearm Agreement was a raging success. Or was it? Now, particularly for people who are going to be watching this down the track, not today, but down the track, you'll be able to pause, you'll be able to go away and do some research of your own. And this research, it's out there, like the data is out there for all the countries that I'm going to talk about. And you can find this yourself. I dug it up initially back in about 2016 when I started getting involved with Shooters Union. And I was staggered to learn the rhetoric that we've been given from our political leaders is that the National Firearms Agreement post-Port Arthur did a wonderful thing for firearm deaths in this country. And John Howard gets held up on this pedestal, you know, the gold standard of gun laws globally. And John Howard, to this day, you know, is held in such high regard with his implementation of the National Firearm Agreement. Now, so much so that political parties, Labor, Liberal, National, anyone, is reluctant to do anything that might go anywhere near breaking down little elements of the National Firearm Agreement. In fact, I've coined the phrase the National Firearm Disagreement because every state seems to disagree anyway. So you can go and pull the data on what happened. And I've been saying for years, John Howard's gun laws were that awesome. They were fantastic. We had a decline in gun deaths. And if you go and ask someone in the media, They'll give you the stats, 1996, 97 onwards, say 97 onwards after Port Arthur. We've had a decline in firearm deaths. Isn't that wonderful? John Howard's gun laws worked. Really? Let's have a look at this graph. And I did this quite simply. It's uncluttered of numbers and anything complicated. You'll notice that Australia, the blue line at the bottom, over a period of roughly 40 years, has had a constant decline in firearm deaths. Now, did John Howard's gun laws work prior to them being implemented? How do you have a constant decline before a point in time and attribute the gun laws to achieving an outstanding result when the trend was fairly constant the whole way through? And so you sort of get a bit of a question in the back of your mind, well, what about New Zealand? New Zealand's a lot like Australia, similar culture, similar kind of regulatory environment, different gun laws, of course, but look at the New Zealand curve. That's the one just above ours. In fact, if anything, in raw data terms, they were slightly worse per 100,000 population. So you go, okay, New Zealand's only a very small little country. Maybe it's an anomaly. And I then sat down and went and looked at Canada because I thought Canada would be, another similar kind of, come from a similar background. And then you hold up the Canadian numbers, and that's this one here. There's a constant decline from back in the 70s. In fact, actually, for some of these countries, I could find data going further back than 1980, but not all of them. There was a decline going back into the 70s there, just like there was here in Australia. So you've got to say John Howard's gun laws were absolutely brilliant, absolutely fantastic. They not only worked here, they not only worked 20 years prior, but they did the same thing in Canada and New Zealand. And if you're intellectually honest with yourself, you can't believe for 1 minute that the National Firearm Agreement did anything to assist. And then people say, and David Leyonhjelm's mentioned already, we get compared to the US. Well, God, I can tell you, John Howard's gun laws were so awesome. Look what they did in the US back between 1980 and 1997 and continuing on. I mean, it flattened out a little bit, but there's been a decline in firearm deaths in the US as well. John Howard, I don't know why he's not given a knighthood. I mean, really. So I want everyone to think, particularly when you're talking with people in the political arena, to, in a very condensed way, point out that this is real data. This is not made up by me. Anyone can go and research it, but it is real. So why is it that anyone, anybody, nobody, no politician, nobody should give credence or credit to the NFA, and most importantly, any of the laws and regulations that are pinned to the NFA, which is literally most of them. So as we all know, criminals don't follow laws, only law-abiding people do. I think the NFA was a gross tragedy in itself. And the fact that we think that legislation, the way it is and the way it's going, is supported by the National Firearm Agreement, is fatally flawed. And we should really look to, at every opportunity, bringing into the discussion some reality and look at the real problem, not the perceived problem. So one of my pet topics is the firearm industry, the shooting industry, and we're going to call them one and the same because the shooting sports, agriculture, etc., and the industry, that's dealers, etc., manufacturers, we're all in this together. One doesn't go without the other, or if one goes, the other goes, and that is actually a significant risk. How do we affect change, political change? And the only way you're going to get change is through politics. I mean, police departments will constantly look for better ways to make our life more miserable, so much so that they implement policies that are not lawful. And that happens in every state. We're seeing a major assault on that here in Queensland at the moment. So I got involved with Shooters Union back in 2015, 2016, and it was a rather opportune time because founders, Graham Park, Jen Lindsley, and a few others had started to realise that whilst the organisation was growing, how could we achieve more impact and more influence in the political and regulatory world? Well, somewhere around about that time, Graham wisely selected a company called Cole Lawson that was run by a lady, Margaret Lawson, one of the country's leading communication and media companies. And her, and along with Nathan Schultz, who we still do some work with today, started a program of raising awareness and credibility for Shooters Union, but also just generally speaking, the shooting community. They were working for us, obviously, and we invested significant money in this process. But this also applied to any other group that, in the, whether it be the Clay Target Association or SSAA or whoever, doesn't matter. Once you raise the awareness and the credibility of an industry, the rising tide lifts all the boats. So we had a concentrated effort on making sure us as individuals had media training so that when asked a question in the media, we didn't say something stupid, but we also got the message out in about 10 to 12 seconds. And that gained us far more TV and radio exposure than ever before. I must admit, I got a 10-second quote on Channel 10 TV once over the fellow who confronted a burglar in the middle of the night and with a firearm in his hand took the individual into the local police station. A week later, they came back and confiscated all his guns. Allegedly, it was unloaded, and I made the comment, well, effectively, he was just carrying a stick. Well, that obviously was, a fairly fresh take and a funny take on, dealing with someone with a firearm, but it was really only a stick. And that made it into the media. So sometimes your little 10-second opportunity, your 10 seconds of fame can be very profound and it can convey a significant message. So you've got to make sure you're doing a good job of it. I'm not sure that was my best effort ever, but certainly that one went somewhere. So getting more media quoting of an organisation, and this applies to unions, farming groups, industry groups of all sorts. Politicians and their staff troll the newspapers, the TV, radio news. They really do pay attention to the mood of the public. And the best way to measure your influence in the public arena is how you're portrayed in the media. So this was something that we worked very, very hard on. And by about 2019, I don't remember the exact dates, but that was about the time we employed a media director. And he has a very long career with one of the major publishing firms and still does other freelance media and publishing work. But it brought us the ability to be able to react when us as volunteers might be off doing other things. He had his finger on the pulse of what was going on around the countryside, in the media, politically or otherwise. But being someone that was able to craft a good delivery or craft a press release in such a way that we didn't embarrass ourselves or say something stupid meant that we had a consistent, persistent, professional front. So what did that do for us in the political world? Well, all of a sudden, our acceptance in the political sphere, both state and federally, ratcheted up at a great rate. We were given far more airtime, as it were, in the political arena, and we were treated more seriously. And one of the serious outcomes of being treated very seriously was I'm just trying to think now, was it 2019, 18 Queensland election? I forget the date. The Queensland Firearm Dealers Association ran a campaign called Flick 'em, Put the Majors Last. Now, that originally started as Put Labor Last, because obviously the current Labor government and the Adler shotgun, lever action shotgun debacle. So at that time, we were having regulatory changes in all the states recategorizing lever action shotguns and 5-round magazines versus 8. In Queensland at the time, we had the opportunity for the Liberal National Party, with support of the crossbench, to roll the government on this regulation change weeks before the state election. The one time we could have given the Labor Party a good caning, and this was it. And Graham had worked very extensively with the LNP. Robbie Catter and Shane Knuth were on side, and I'd worked closely with 2 ex-Labor but then independent MPs. And oddly enough, we had them on side 100%. So it went to the floor of Parliament, and at the 11th hour, we had the 2 Catters, we had the 2 independents, and we had one Liberal National guy, Tony Perrott, and we, to this day, applaud Tony Perrott for his brevity. The LNP rolled on us at the last minute. So this Flick 'em, Put Labor Last got completely rebuilt at significant expense to Flick 'em, Put the Majors Last. Now, what did that do? They say elections have consequences. Well, that particular action had consequences. And sometimes you've just got to smack the political parties across the snout, a bit like a rolled up newspaper on a naughty dog. The net result of Put the Majors Last meant they might still get elected, but they lost a significant amount of primary vote funding, millions of dollars. And the Liberal National Party didn't want to meet with us for quite some time. They were hurt. The Labor Party were as well, but they tended to keep their cards closer to their chest. The LNP eventually met with us, and didn't they give us a bit of an unloading on what it cost them and the number of staffers they had to let go? And we literally said, well, you treat us this way, pat us on the head, rub our tummy, then stab us in the back. You've got to listen. So having the ability to show strength, and David Leyonhjelm talked about strength in numbers, that whole campaign up to that election, the Dealers Association, the Sporting Shooters Association, SSAA, had a big contribution with the Flick 'em campaign, and Shooters Union ran a whole bunch of other in parallel media work in radio and print. We had a major impact on that election. We also got Nick Demetto elected. We also got Stephen Andrew elected to Parliament in later years, and that's been a fantastic thing. So having a good relationship with media bought us a better respect with the political parties, and where we are today is that we've got much better relationships across the board, and that includes industry relationships with other groups, dealers, parties, and other sporting groups. And we're not treated as just some little minority interest group. So now that we're noticed and can't be ignored, we're now in a position where we can affect change. And that's happened numerous times where we've been able to influence an outcome or modify an outcome to be more suitable to the likings of industry, and particularly during the COVID period. There's a lot of things that we rolled back there. Our constant challenge, though, is legislative change that is not in our best interests. And right now, we have a particular here in Queensland, but we've got it in Western Australia and in just about every state. Any government can literally do what it likes because there's nobody holding a balance of power. So this is where we need to get more political. I know a lot of people in the shooting sports, shooting industry, no, not really interested in politics. Well, my answer to that is, if you're a firearm owner, you are interested in politics. End of message. don't care what you think, you are interested in politics and you need to be involved. So we as the shooting community need to step up. The only way we're going to improve our lot is interact with the political parties, with the political process, and we need to stand up and be accounted for. Over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And just as a bit of a footnote to working with parties, there was a similar exercise in Victoria in the early 2000s. It was led by the Combined Firearms Council of Victoria. And that was actually a collaborative effort. It was led by SSAA Victoria, and it brought in the Victorian Clay Target Association, Victorian Amateur Pistol Association, Target Rifle Victoria, the Victorian Rifle Association. There's probably about a dozen or so groups that got together after the 2002 handgun restrictions, because it was realised that this was not a discussion about handguns, this was about policy. And one thing that came as a result of that was, this is a policy from 2006 from the then Brax Labor government, and you can see it's a joint policy for the four-wheel driving, but it also brings in hunting, and it's not often we see governments bring out specific pro-hunting policies. We are going to see one a bit later today from the Northern Territory, but I think that this, whilst this particular document is not overly exciting, it's where we got to get the parties to think, and I think that part of that Flickham campaign actually achieved that. So this document, whilst it harks on a bit about things that the government did, to help shooters, mostly to do with hunting, including supporting duck season, just sort of general things like that. There was also money for shooting clubs, but that was actually a consequence of the 2006 Commonwealth Games that were being held in Victoria at the time. And but going forward, the government did make some commitments to, again, facilitate hunting in Victoria. So whilst, I'm not going to go into the detail of this now, but whilst the particular content here isn't overly exciting from a legislative point of view, it was nevertheless good to see governments articulate a position in the lead up to an election that was actually on our side. So I just wanted to point that out because it was just an example of what, some of the things that can be done. Now we want more than that. We need better politicians in place. We need better policy. We need better laws. But I think that's part of the progression that we need to go.
Yes, Neil, if I may just add to your previous comment on Victoria, look at the duck hunting issue just recently in the last 12 months, where the CFMEU, I think, came along to, back then it was the Andrew government, and they literally said, if you do anything to affect duck hunting in Victoria, construction on all your state government construction projects will cease. And mysteriously enough, any ideas of duck hunting restrictions went straight into the waste paper basket or the shredder. So it just proves that, and that didn't come from a shooting industry organisation, that was a union. So it just proves that enough people get motivated about something, you can affect change.
Yeah, and that is also to recognise the role of the ETU, as was pointed out to me. So it was very much obviously a pressure point for the Labor government in Victoria. Anybody else want to talk about the matters that David raised?
I just wanted to comment. Look, I wanted to thank David Brown's and David Leyonhjelm's efforts, particularly on the Adler ban as well. As an Adler owner, I appreciate that people had stood up and talked sense about the issues at the time. I don't know if I didn't hear it was discussed earlier about the technology aspect of it. As the anti-gun lobby, the hysteria at the time was talking about the Adler firearm being new, new technology, and they say this every couple of years. There's always some type of a witch hunt that discusses some new firearms technology, which is completely unfounded. As a lever action firearm, I believe the design itself is modelled off of the 1877 or 1887, I should say, lever action firearm. So very, very old technology, nothing new there. And I think if there wasn't people like them standing up and telling sense on this, we would have probably seen an outright ban on these types of firearms. So I'm very grateful for that.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, so we'll move on, and our next speaker is former Senator Nigel Scullion. Just putting up the slide. So that's the topic of his talk. Now, Nigel was a professional fisherman before being elected to the Senate in 2001, representing the country Liberal Party in the NT. He was deputy leader of the National Party from 2007 to 2013. He held ministerial office under 4 prime ministers and was the only minister to hold the same portfolio in 3 governments. And he retired at the 2019 federal election. So, if you can hear with me, I've just got to...
Thank you very much, Neil. I really appreciate the invitation. Can I also acknowledge great thanks to David Leyonhjelm and David. How's that?
Yeah, be better. There you go.
Crackerjack. So I think there were fantastic contributions. So since I left Parliament, without going too much into it, I thought I wasted an awful lot of my life not fishing and shooting full time, and I've changed that to adopt my new life. So I've actually managed to do 5 trips around Australia, probably 50-50 shooting and fishing all the time. And it was great to be under this illusion that the National Firearms Agreement had allowed me to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction seamlessly and all those sort of things. Unfortunately, that isn't a reality. And as David Brown indicates, now in Western Australia, if you have a firearms licence in the Northern Territory or anywhere else, it is worthless in Western Australia. So look, what I thought I might do, obviously, well, not obviously, but there's many of the issues that were mentioned by the previous 2 contributors. So what I'll do, I'll talk a bit about the actual impact of the West Australian Firearms Act, just go through the nuts so people can understand the significant, and I think the term draconian, significant, all these sort of terms have actually been used by the Minister, and that is significant, and the Commissioner, because they're very proud that this is legislation that goes beyond the pale. So following some fatal shootings, I think in 2018 and 2024, respectively, I think 6 and 2 lots of victims of these both mental health tragedies. And there was an expectation that the government would be able to do something about that. And there were some circumstances that are like almost the perfect storm. There were certainly more snakes and ladders in Western Australia during that time. So about March in 2022, they announced that they're going to have reforms. So I think it was the 27th of June this year, it actually passed and was assented to become legislation. But it is fairly different in that most of the regulation hasn't actually been written. So the detail. So again, it's a peculiar circumstance that I'll get to. So they decided that they would initiate the legislation with a staggered introduction, of which we're not actually sure which parts are going to be introduced on that, and sometimes that does happen. They've introduced a buyback in these circumstances that concludes at the end of this month. So after this month, you won't be able to use a buyback that, by the way, says a double-barrel shotgun that's less than 6 weeks old, 6 years old, is worth $750. And I think if it's more than 6 years old, it's $420. So you get a bit of a sense of that. It's $63 million, 31st of August, or the full use of the fund, whichever comes first, that's it. So they've introduced a numerical limit. So in Western Australia, there's a maximum number of firearms you can hold. If you're a hunter, it's 5. In competition, across different competitions, there's a maximum of 10. If you're hunting and in competition, it's still a maximum of 10. So some of the most important things is actually how it's impacted on non-hunters and shooters, which are property owners. Yes, they may have an interest in that. So if you're going to give a written authority, and there's 2 in Western Australia, the first is that this enables you to gain a firearms licence. The second is what they call a temporary authority. Yes, you can come shooting here for a couple of days. Both of them now, to be written, the police will have to attend your property and inspect it, and they will decide if that property is suitable, and any restrictions with things like calibre, etc., can be placed on that property. It's a pretty significant change. All club letters are now non-valid, and all club letters that enable you to have a firearm in Western Australia have to be reapplied for. Interestingly, there's now a mandatory health check. So it was going to be that 90,000 licence holders had to go to a psychiatrist. Of course, they decided to move away from that. Whether it was ambered or not, I don't know. Now you're going to have to go to your doctor immediately to maintain your licence. And every 5 years, if you're over 80 years of old, you have to go every year. No one's really sure what the medical practitioner is going to provide, except it's not going to be medical information to the police, but whatever they provide to the police will make a decision on that. Mandatory training, it's the same as introduced, the same as many places in Australia. The collector's licence, the provision in the collector's licence is that, for example, in World War II pistols, it must have a significant historical value related to World War II. So it's the police that make the decision if that's a significant historical value. And so all of these are part of many of the changes. There's some heirloom firearms. They're no longer allowed to be collectible. If you've got heirloom firearms, they'll have to be permanently incapacitated or licensed under the new scheme. Storage requirements, they quote the storage requirements as new stringent requirements, although regulations haven't actually laid out what those requirements are going to have. But depending on licence type, storage location, the firearm category and the number of firearms, apparently some of the existing approved cabinets may still be valid, but they're going to let us know once the regulations are drafted. Primary producers, to be a primary producer, you need a letter from the ATO. You need also, though, not only a letter from the ATO saying you're a primary producer, you need to establish, you need to provide the police with your business accounts. You're going to be allowed a maximum of 10 firearms. Family members and are going to be authorised persons. Again, a decision from the police. I think there's the fact that many of these issues are no longer consistent with legislative frameworks in other jurisdictions is obviously I think, of great concern that there isn't any consistency, because someone like myself who travels, if you want to travel to shoot in a competition or hunt as I do, it is certainly the complete. You can no longer pretend that we have a national firearms framework. So the narrative, as I've indicated, from the West Australian government were the two mental health issues, and their narrative was the Osmington shooting and the Floriat shooting in 2024. We need a significant reform of the Firearms Act, and any of the rationales around this are around public safety. It's about public safety. When we finish this, the public's going to be a lot safer, and the inference is that these mental health issues will not occur because of these sweeping issues. Again, officer safety, police officer safety in terms of occupational health and safety has been mentioned throughout this by the Commissioner. So I might just touch on the perfect storm that has existed in Western Australia. First of all, we had a government with no political restraint required. They had 90% of the seats in Parliament, 90%. So normally people would calibrate what we're going to do against popularity, against, well, will we maybe win a seat or not a seat with this? But the whole process in Western Australia seems to be characterised by a government who know that this is in the margins and we're just going to be doing absolutely anything that we want. So the actual vote of the bill went through with 95% support. The three Liberals, which is 5%, supported Labor, 90%, 95% support. The commentary in the media was supportive generally of the change. There's a highly respected commissioner at the time, Cole Blanche, who's a huge advocate of these changes, principally because of the occupational health and safety issues for his officers, and the relationship between the minister, who was a big supporter of the commissioner, and so all of these issues landing in the same place, really a perfect storm in Western Australia. Now, despite significant resources and lobbying from West Australian Firearms Community Alliance, a lot of resources from others, from SSAA, assistance from CIFA, the Shooters Union, and don't be offended, I've missed you out, but lots of people around Australia assisted them. Despite that, I think a reasonable person would say they really failed to achieve any real impact on what the government wanted to do. So that's all pretty miserable, but what I sort of is, what can we do now? What should we be doing to ensure that what happened in West Australia can't just happen to us? Now, look, we can't control whether the government has 95%, although I think we can certainly have an impact. I believe we need a single, united, well-funded, representative body, not a new one. The great irony is I really like the model in West Australia of an alliance of existing groups. And that body really needs to develop and deliver a political strategy and an educational strategy and engagement strategy. So we've had some success, I know people will know, so politicians have engaged with poly shoots around Australia, they've been very successful. We've had similar media events and we've had some educational events. But there are plenty of places where it doesn't happen. There's plenty of politicians who haven't been engaged to the extent that they should. There's plenty of organisations, and as David Brown mentioned, the engagement with new partners like unions. I mean, I'll take this opportunity to thank the unions that were responsible for the change because it was lost. The government had decided, again, a very powerful government, they had decided we are going to have an inquiry, and on the back of that inquiry will tell us that we can move ahead. Now, the inquiry, in fact, told them quite the opposite. Duck shooting in Victoria was sustainable. The word was, well, they're just going to do it anyway. The union turned up and said, oh, no, you're not. And I think what we need to do is understand we need to be innovative about our engagement with new partners. We have new threats, and I think part of the challenge that we have is identifying some of these new threats. Threats like the transport of firearms, insurance for actual firearms, hunting, woke generally. There's a lot of organisations, including Australia Post, who have had a go at, look, I don't really want to carry, we don't need to move firearms, it's all too hard. I think we also, that organisation should be providing assistance with administrative appeal tribunals, particularly in terms of a precedent or a test case. And in West be particularly important. I think for the first time, providing independent technical advice around some, instead of just saying, oh, we'll just ask the police. So the police in Western Australia, we didn't need the anti-gun lobby or No Guns Australia. We had a police commissioner, and I think that the risk is, in Australia, self-evident that we now have a precedent about how to go about it. So we spoke briefly about the Adler ban. I'd like to leave off on something that we did right. It was really a great example of a well-coordinated strategy. They talked about the new technology, rapid fire, threat to public safety, the same stuff. And whilst I can't speak about details of what happened in Cabinet, I was a Cabinet Minister at the time, what I can speak about is, I think the thing that made the greatest difference, and thanks very much, David Leyonhjelm, for your work in this area, but we worked across Parliament, is that when people understood technically that this was not new technology, that this would not provide any further lethality, and were able to, in an evidence-based way, it was very difficult for them to continue the proposed ban, in fact, the temporary ban that was already placed on the Adler. So yes, we can get it, but we do need to provide to the right people the right information at the right time. And I think a national organisation of the existing organisations, or an arrangement between those organisations, would be able to achieve similar outcomes in the future. So thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you for that, Nigel. And the panelists would like to comment or ask a question, they'll, feel free.
I'll have a quick a word there. You're quite correct on national associations and people working together. We have found, working with CIFA, working with dealers, and just the experience we've had, particularly here in Queensland, but also at the federal level, you can't get one association to represent everyone's interests. So that's why we have all these other interest groups. But certainly, you're quite correct. The major groups, the clay target associations, the SSAAs, ourselves, that cross all of the boundaries. As we go forward from here, and things are getting, more competitive in the regulatory sense, in other words, it's us versus them, we're going to need to do that a lot more. And I'm delighted, actually, one of our panelists today is another one of the big association representatives, because it's very topical. In fact, he and I have discussed this as to going forward into the future. We're all going to need to pull together. And one of our guys in New South Wales has even been looking at how to interact with trade union movements that are supportive of our cause, because a lot of our members are builders, electricians, mining, what have you. They understand how the union movement works. We're certainly starting to talk to some people up here about how to learn from their experiences. So thank you, Nigel. I think you've probably ticked a few things in the wish list for certainly us and other groups moving forward into the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
Okay. Interesting you use the word competitive, that we're competitive with regulatory agencies. I'm sure it's not adversarial.
Was probably being polite. It's
Okay.
It's adversarial for sure.
Okay. Thank you for that. And we're actually making good time, which is pleasing, because I thought this actually might go beyond the 3-hour mark, but I think we're going to be pretty close to it. Move on to the next presentation, which is the topic, how we become politically relevant, and the speaker is Tom Kenyon, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Sporting Shooters Association. Now, Tom is a former, I've just got to that's it. Tom is a former state Labor MP from South Australia, where he served as a minister and government whip. He's married with 3 adult children, And Tom is a rifle and pistol shooter. Since leaving Parliament, Tom has worked to commercialise university research and in the cyber security industry. So welcome aboard, Tom, and the floor is yours.
Well, excuse me. Thank you very much, Neil. And I'm sort of 2.5 weeks into the job, so forgive me if I'm a little bit more general rather than specific in this conversation. But I think in some ways I've come into the job in the right time in terms of the organisation. SSAA is looking at exactly the same problems everybody else is, probably woken up by Western Australia and realising that they're not going to leave us alone, that we can't just go about running our clubs and and putting out magazines, in our case putting out magazines and everything else, and expect them just to leave us alone and everyone to think it's great. I think the politicians in general see us as a bit of an easy hit. There's a lot of pressure from people, particularly from inside the police, but through the bureaucracy as well, to always reduce the number of firearms. So I think what we've seen in Western Australia is going to be attempted to roll out nationally, and we've got an opportunity now to try and scramble and get ourselves organised. I agree with Nigel that that we need to work together in a way, not a new organisation. But I think the key, and David said the same thing as well, we've talked about this, that the key for us is to work together in our own interests, and those interests of the survival of our sport, go across all clubs, all organisations, and everything else. So really, what we really need out of that is common messaging, I think, so that whenever we go to meet with politicians, whenever we're communicating with politicians and everything else, and communicating inside the community as well, we're sending out common messages, so that we're not. It's easy for ministers to pick off industries when they're fragmented. You can have 5 people come and see you and 4 of them can say the same thing and one can say something slightly different, and you grab that one person, you make them stand up next to you in a press conference and they say, oh no, this is all fine, we just want a slight change, and it undermines everybody else's message, especially in the public mind. So that unity of messaging is very important, and that's really, and we can do that relatively quickly, right? So merging a new organisation or combining organisation takes a long time. There's a lot of consultation. You've got to overcome a lot of cultural differences. I don't think we have that time. So just working together more closely and more effectively is definitely going to be a better way of doing it. So our broad strategy at the SSAA is threefold really, and it's the first is increase the number of gun owners. So there's a body of work that needs to take part before that. So there needs to be some genuine research done, sort of building on that work that David was talking about media training and everything else. This is almost, we need to do, focus groups, focus groups are sort of qualitative polling, and there's quantitative polling, which is your normal surveys. We've got to do both of that. We've got to understand how we're perceived in the community and how we perceive ourselves as firearms owners, and then we need to understand what messaging works in the broader community to soften attitudes towards our sport, and then we need to start rolling that messaging out in a coordinated way and a sustained way as well. This is not something we can do over 3 months. This is something we'll do over 3, 4, 5, 10 years. So once we have done this work, then we can start moving forward on delivering it. So that the first thing is increase the number of gun owners, convince people that it's a good thing to do, that they can take part in the sport. They can do target shooting, they can do pistol target shooting, they can do hunting, whatever it is. Increase those numbers. The key number is 5%. So in my mind anyway, people might have a different opinion, but currently about 3.5% of the population are firearms owners. I'm not sure whether that's adults or general population, but why I think 5 is important is because a marginal seat is defined as 5% or less. So if a margin in a seat is 5% or less, it's a marginal seat. It's much more likely to change hands. And if you have 5% of the population participate in a certain sport or do a certain thing, then suddenly that makes politicians take notice, because if they think that government can be lost because a bunch of people in marginal seats arced up about something they did, they will pay attention. So, as a minimum, I think we need to be at that 5%. We're below that now, and I think we're very vulnerable because of it. As an aside, for the SSAA, our sort of next step 2, is to increase the percentage of people who are members of SSAA. So currently it's about 25% of shooters or firearms license holders are members of the SSAA. We obviously want to have a bigger percentage of that, but you know, that's just an internal thing for us. That's not important to our overall strategy. What is important is that all member groups, all member organisations, seek to increase the number of the participation of shooters in general in some form of organisation, so that, you know, they start getting messaging and stuff from everyone, and not just relying on YouTube or Facebook or what have you, because it's not necessarily a friendly environment for us as it is. So so that membership of organisations in general is important, and from our point of view, SSAA, of course. The next step after that, the third step, is increasing the political awareness first, and then the political participation secondly afterwards. So that involves just telling people what's going on. Often they don't know. It's likely that many shooters in South Australia don't understand. I say South Australia, for instance, because that's where I am, but I'd bet most shooters in South Australia don't understand what just happened in Western Australia. And that would be the same around the country, I suspect. Now, that's part of our job, is to tell people what has happened, so they're prepared for what's coming, that they know what's looking around, and they want to do something about it. They're actually taking an action, and some of that will involve, in my view, changing behaviour. So the worst place for any interest group to be is where they're taken for granted by both sides. So if your vote, the way you vote, is politically built in, then, and for instance, the Labor Party think, for instance, that they can't win our vote, and the Liberal Party think that they can't lose our vote, then no one is ever going to pay you attention. And the reason for that is because they don't have to, because you will never affect them directly. They can spend all their time and money focusing on those people that will affect them directly. So what that means is we need to be, as a group, we need to be prepared to change our vote. We cannot be locked in to a particular party. We need to vote for individuals rather than parties in individual seats and in the upper houses. And we need to be prepared to vote on firearms issues. So, you know, I think a lot of the time people will say, oh, well, I'm just voting for this party because they're going to be better on tax, or they're going to be better on this. Well, we need them to be voting what's better for firearms. This is my sport. This is important to me, so I'm going to vote accordingly. So making people in our organisation, or convincing people in our organisations to sometimes walk away from decades-old political allegiances is something that we need to do. And I think a key part of that is simply punishing bad behaviour and rewarding good behaviour. And you need to be prepared to do both equally. So I think that Flickham campaign that David was talking about is a prime example of that. Is you just you both did the wrong thing, so bang, now we're voting against both of you. Now we and you know, and in another after I left the Labor Party, I went and reformed with a couple of other people, reformed Family First, and we had a particular issue here in South Australia that we were working on. And we looked at all the voting records at the election that came up in 2022. We looked at the voting records of incumbents, so the sitting member, and then if they voted in favour of the way that we wanted them to vote, we preferenced them, and if they voted against the way we wanted them to vote, we preferenced against them. So, and regardless of the views of the opponent, because we thought it was more important that people got punished for what they did, and we took our chances with the next person, and we can always vote against that next person next time, right? That they're subject 4 years later to exactly the same consequences for their actions. And it's getting very ruthless in the way. Now, another step to that down the road may be getting our members more involved in political parties. So joining major parties, being involved in pre-selection votes of major parties, maybe becoming candidates internally in major parties, because government is formed in major parties. Having shooters, for instance, as marginal seat members is important because then marginal seat members get listened to by cabinet ministers. So when I was a marginal seat member in South Australia, I could walk into any of the ministers and say, what you are doing is critically affecting my chances of winning at the next election in my seat. You need to change you need to change what you're doing, and they would listen. Now they may not change, but they had to listen and they had to take it seriously. And at the moment, we're not having many people who can walk in the door of ministers from major parties and say, you're affecting my chances and therefore you're affecting your own chances of being in government. And that's something over the longer term, that's something that we need to work on as well. So to David's point, I think earlier he talked about, a lot of our members, this is true of us and I'm sure other organisations as well, a lot of our members are not interested in politics. And my answer to people when they say that is, well, politics is interested in you, so you may as well wake up. Right? So, just because they're not paying attention doesn't mean they're not going to get affected. And so that's sort of my motivation behind it. So that's our broad strategy: increase the number of firearms license owners or holders, increase the number of those who are SSAA members or members of an organisation, let's say that way, if we're taking this as a broad strategy of shooter groups, and then increasing the political awareness and political participation of those members. And I think that's going to take some, as Nigel was talking about, it's going to take some significant resources. We're going to need to start pooling our resources in terms of cash, especially. Campaigning is expensive. There's only really two things that MPs worry about, and that's votes and money. And they only care about money because it helps them win votes. Right? So, we need obviously to cash ourselves up. That will mean special appeals throughout our organisations and everyone else. And I think we need to develop fighting funds internally so that we can start affecting these campaigns as they come up, not just on policy issues that we're interested in, firearms policy issues, but also in individual seats and individual campaigns, so that when someone is particularly hostile, we can try and influence their election. And when someone is particularly friendly, we can try and influence their election as well. So, that's just 2.5 weeks into the job, SSAA. That's where we're going to try and head. Thanks, Neil.
Okay, thank you for that, Tom. That was really good. And I'm just going to do something, and then we'll open it to the floor. Anybody got a question or comment?
So I do. That's very refreshing to hear from Tom. It's obvious Tom has been in politics and understands politics and understand how it works. My view has always been that criticising existing politicians for what they do is a futile exercise. What we have to do is change their constituency, change the thinking, the feedback that the politicians hear, so that they then respond more consistent with what we want them to do. If less than 5% of the population are firearm owners, their politicians are by and large going to be listening to 95% of the population, not 5%. Those 95% of the population think if you don't have Australia's gun laws, you have America's gun laws. As I said in my presentation, they don't know where the Czech Republic even exists. They probably don't know where Vermont is either. So politicians feel very safe in doing what they did in Western Australia with Papalia's law. Nonsensical nonsense, but it's superficially appealing if you're ignorant and uninformed about firearms. And so they vote for it, including the Liberal Party members vote for it. That's the outcome you get when the politicians involved think it's safe. What we have to do is make it unsafe for the politicians to maintain that attitude, and that's only going to occur if their votes and their money are threatened, exactly as Tom has said. It's delightful to hear this coming from SSAA. I can assure you, Tom, we would never have heard from your predecessor saying something like that. It is absolutely refreshing.
Oh, I'm glad you're refreshed. That's good. I think it was an attitude. It was the change in CEO was an opportunity for the SSAA to reassess, what it's been doing for a while and how it needs to behave in the future. So I think that's where I got to look in. I suspect, a former politician wouldn't have been so well received a few years ago by the organisation, but it's good to hear that now. I think I was going to make another point and I've completely forgotten what it was. Your point, David, actually about the changing the hearts and minds of the general population, exactly right. That's sort of the longer term battle. So there's two parts of this: is organising our own group of shooters, and you can, in marginal seats, you can do a lot with a small number of people. That's not so true in safe seats, but in marginal seats you absolutely can. So we have the opportunity to to have an influence early before we've even managed to broadly change attitudes in the community. But the broader longer term gain, and this is where the NRA in America, for instance, has been very successful, is changing the attitudes of Americans in general towards firearms. And I think, that's a broader task for us. And they started doing that in the early 70s. So, deliberately, very deliberately. So, and you see how long it's taken them to get to the point. I mean, it was only in the 90s that the Americans had a 10-year assault rifle ban that Clinton was able to implement. So there's been a significant change even since the 90s in recent times, to where you couldn't even do that now. I mean, they can't even do background checks for mentally ill people or whatever else. So that's how successful they've been in terms of changing attitudes towards firearm ownership in the US.
Okay, there's a couple of things I wouldn't mind raising. Tom, you said I think that SSAA was working it by what happened in Western Australia, and I really do implore any shooter who is not across what's happened there, you need to find out, because it's more than draconian. It's really treating people, like people were treating other regimes in the past that we reflect on. And you also said we don't have time for that. I think in the context of forming a new organisation, and I don't favour forming a new organisation, but I do think we need to have a united front. You talk about time. The NFA is now nearly 30 years old, 28 years old, and my fear is that somebody's going to say, "Oh, he's old. It needs to be reviewed." And that's when they're going to be going for the lowest common denominator. Dave Brown, you were laughing away at something during that speech. Would you like to enlighten us?
Tom used a phrase, and as you know, and some people watching this might be aware of an aviation friend, but a firearm industry media legend. It's a family legacy of firearm media.
Name him.
Tom Gresham as well. Well, his name's Tom as well.
Right.
And this comment about you mightn't be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And that's probably a comment that gets used a lot. But I think across our memberships, and this is something that we all, as membership organisations, we all need to probably remind members that, whether they like it or not, just because you're interested in your play target shooting or your ISSF pistol shooting, and these rules and the changes to laws and whatever, they don't affect me. They may well affect you next. And politics will have something to do with your sport sooner or later. So you need to be interested now. You need to be aware of what's coming down the pipe. And I think certainly at times we've been pretty good at doing that in motivating people to write ministerial reports. In fact, anybody watching this, if they ever feel that they've got a message or a complaint with, say, a regulatory body like the QPS or West Australian Police or whoever, a ministerial complaint's a good way to start because they get listened to. They have to be listened to. People need to be willing to put these things in, get involved in the political fight. You may not want to, but if you don't, sooner or later, it's going to come and bite you on the tail. So, I was 100% behind everything Tom Kenyon was just saying. It was like music to my ears.
And I would just elaborate by saying Tom Gresham runs Gun Talk, which is a podcast out of the United States. And whilst they're very heavily focused on 2A, a lot of the themes that we're talking about here are very much sort of what he focuses on too. Okay, so the next presentation is from Nick DeMeadow, who's the member for Hinchinbrook for Caddi's Australia Party. And this actually is a pre-recorded presentation. So I'll hit play now. Our next speaker is Nick DeMeadow. He's a member for Hinchinbrook in Queensland, and his topic is communicating with politicians. And I think Nick, Hinchinbrook is in the top half of Queensland and northern Townsville. Okay, and you're the deputy leader of Caddi's Australian Party. You were elected in November 2017, and you've got a background in metal fabrication and mining, and interest in everything from water skiing to drag racing, motocross, and shooting. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Neil, and also thank you for everyone in the Australian shooting community that's logged in this afternoon. My background in shooting, I've grown up on a sugarcane farm, so started with an air rifle and then progressed to a 22 as a child and eventually up to a 410. Spent a fair bit of time as a young fella duck shooting with my father, and then as I progressed into adult life, got into pig hunting as well as roo shooting. These days, I'm an avid pistol shooter, and I spend a fair bit of time making sure I'm getting my shoots done for the year and up there at the Townsville Pistol Club.
Okay, and in terms of your topic today, communicating with politicians, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so whenever any shooting organisation or shooting fraternity wants to get together and communicate with politicians, it can always be a tricky way to sort of try and figure out ways to broach that. But the thing I've learned over the 2 terms of Parliament, 7 years that I've been in the Queensland Parliament, is most politicians are really only concerned about one thing. And this might be a cynical way of looking at it, but most politicians are interested in holding their seat, but also keeping their constituents and people in their area happy. So I've found over the years the best way to communicate with ministers is to demonstrate strength in numbers. So that's one of the reasons why I push very heavily for people to become licensed firearm owners here in Queensland, because most Queensland politicians, I think politicians in general, they're always looking at the numbers and they're looking at those marginal seats and they're making sure that they've got the numbers to hold those marginal seats. And as shooters, it doesn't matter what organisation you're involved with, as shooters, if you can demonstrate to those politicians that there are numbers there and there is enough numbers to sway votes on a point that actually matters to those voters, you'll actually get those politicians' ears to prick up. So whether it's an issue that a government might be bringing in, making it harder for firearms owners or licensed firearm owners, or even if there's something, for example, I know silencers and those sorts of safety devices for firearm users are a big thing here in Queensland. And if you can demonstrate that those sort of issues are an issue that would shift the vote come election time, I think most politicians, you'll have their ear. So another thing that I'd also say as well is over the years, using political tools like everything from the media right through to parliamentary petitions are very important. So one thing that we've been able to do over the years is through parliamentary petitions, show that there's a large block vote that's willing to shift their vote on a particular issue. And if that doesn't work, and if meeting with ministers and meeting with local members doesn't work, one lever that we do have left to pull is the media. And sometimes it is tough to get the media on side when it comes to firearms issues. But when you can demonstrate it through either a member of parliament that's on board with the shooting fraternity or shooting organisations that are working hard to show that other voters out there should be sympathising with shooters, it's a very important way of trying to sway the way politicians vote and how their policy development team actually puts things together. So political pain, that's probably the word that I'd use to describe the language that most politicians actually understand. Like I said, I've become a little bit cynical in some politicians over the last 7 years, but I'll definitely say I've never seen a member of parliament or a minister do something usually just because it's the right thing to do. Usually they have to be either invested in it personally or their party has to have invested in it personally. And the other time I've seen politicians move is when they can feel the heat in the kitchen, if that makes sense. So there's a number of ways to apply that heat or political pain to a member of parliament or a minister. And like I said, showing that there's a large block of voters that are willing to shift their vote. If that politician isn't willing to conform or work with that group, is a very good way to demonstrate that there's a reason for them to shift their way of thinking. Another thing that I've noticed over the years is working with your shooting organisations is paramount. It doesn't matter if you're in SSAA, Shooters Union, or the Dealers Association we work with quite well. CIFA is another organisation Canada's Australian Party works with quite well. Over the years, we've been able to demonstrate to ministers through the lobbying of these combined organisations to try and shift policy and shift legislative changes. And one thing that is important, I think, to note today is sometimes there can be a little bit of argy-bargy between different organisations, and it doesn't matter what you're into. It doesn't matter if it's mining. It doesn't matter if it's in all sorts of different sports. There's always going to be different organisations with different, I guess, specific directions they want to take the group in. But what I've found is every organisation in the shooting fraternity here in Queensland, Australia, plays a very important part in making sure that the whole of message gets through to government. Different organisations, I find, have different tactics, and both tactics and all different tactics work at the right time. But I think it's important to acknowledge that everyone plays a very important part in shaping Queensland and Australian firearms policy with governments. Another point I'd like to also make is I'd definitely be looking coming into, well, we've got the October election coming up here in Queensland, and any shooters out there that are actually looking for where to park their vote, where's a safe place to park their vote as a Queensland or an Australian shooter, go for parties that have a strong history in sticking up for their licensed firearm owners. I'm not saying this because I'm with Canada's Australian Party, but I do say do some research, find out about your local member. Their party might not be strong on firearms issues, or not as strong as the Canada's Australian Party or shooters, different other shooting parties. But I would say if you've got a local member that's part of a larger organisation or a larger party, I should say, who's an avid firearms owner or a sports shooter or even a hunter, perhaps having a conversation with them and seeing if that's a safe place to park your vote. I've also had multiple conversations with people that have they're looking to back a political party, and sometimes it's backing a political party with support online, support by helping out when it comes to elections, but also financial support. And I always say if you're going to help a party out, help a party that's actually fighting for firearms issues. So there's a number of people in, say, the Greater Brisbane area that back Canada's Australian Party, and not because we're going to be able to get a member elected in their area, but the important thing is having elected members in the Queensland or the Australian Parliament or whatever state you're in that actually are in there doing the grunt work and fighting for your organisation and your right to be a licensed firearm owner in this great country.
Okay, look, thank you for that, Nick. I guess one of the key messages is back your local MP that'll back shooting, and if that fails, then you can always back your local AFL football team, as I can see you've got there. You talk raises a couple of interesting points, and of course, we don't have the benefit of feedback from the panel today, so I'm just going to fill that void a little bit. Interesting that you talk about political pain, that's actually the currency that we have to deal in. And what is the risk of you know, I think a politician's job really sometimes to make people go away, and I think the major parties are very good at doing that. So how do you recognise, how does a person recognise when they're being, I guess, led by the nose by their local Labor, you know, LNP candidate when they're not serious, being serious about their interaction with you? How do you recognise that?
I guess I'll tell a bit of a story. We have a lot of lobby groups that'll come into the KAP office down there in Brisbane when we're in Queensland Parliament, and they will say, "We want you to help us out with this, and we want you to have a look at adopting this policy." And my first question usually is, "Have you met with anyone else?" And they'll usually say, "Yeah, we met with the Labor person, or we met with the LNP in opposition, and you know, the shadow minister was a really nice person." And my response usually is, I would rather you said that they were a complete a-hole to you and said they would actually deliver something. I've got enough nice people in my life. I don't need any more. I need people that are actually going to do something for you. So I would be putting pressure on someone, whether you're lobbying a state member, whether you're lobbying a candidate or a political party. Put the pleasantries aside sometimes and ask them what, obviously that's part of the interaction, but I'd ask, well, what are you actually going to do for us? How does this materialise? And another important thing I've started telling people is, before a member of parliament after that meeting says, "Can we please get a photo together? I'd love to put that on my social media." What they're trying to do is show people that they're backing you and try and steal a little bit of your credibility. Before you sign up for that photo with a member of parliament, ask them to commit to something and then get a photo.
I love that, because you're dead right. They wanted to give the impression they're on your side.
That's right.
While hedging their bets.
Yep.
And you also talk about the working with those shooting organisations. I mean, one figure which I've got in mind is I believe there's something like 90 plus shooting organisations in Australia. Forget about the ranges. We're talking about just the organisations. We tend to hear about the top few, but not a lot of the boutique ones and small ones. And yeah, I mean, these are all people who I think need to hear that message and realise that politics will never leave them alone.
Yeah, no, we never achieve anything alone. And one thing we need to all understand is it is strength in numbers. There's nothing better for a government than dividing and conquering any sort of group. Doesn't matter if it's if you've got football organisations fighting over the same bucket of funding, or you've got shooting organisations fighting about what's the proper legislation that reflects the view of all of the Queensland or Australian shooters out there. So if you can come to a point where you can agree on stuff and stay strong on that. I like the whole, the Spartan sort of way of fighting. We're a small group, really, shooters, compared to the rest of Australia. But if we stick together, if we hold the line, if we, work with our shields and hold the shell together, we're pretty impenetrable. But as soon as they see that there's a weakness or a chink in the armour, that's what politicians and that's what I guess policy advisors will go after. So strength in numbers, but also sticking together.
Okay. Oh, Nick, look, thank you so much for your time today. I see the Suns didn't quite get up against West Coast Eagles, so
They didn't, but we've got the Suns in the Northern Beaches here at Townsville. Hopefully they get up this afternoon.
Good man. Okay, look, Nick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cheers, Neil, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Okay, so sorry about the technical issues at the front. It actually worked flawlessly yesterday with David. We were playing around with this. And anyway, we got there. So Nick's talk, I thought, was actually very, very illuminating in terms of how to deal with politicians. And I love the tip about don't give them a photo until they give you something. Any of the panelists would like to say something?
No, I think that's straightforward. Neil?
Yeah, I thought it was. Okay. The next presentation, I'll just get the slides back up again, is me. and it is on the hunting policy that the country Liberal Party is has actually developed. It actually was released about a week ago. And as I said before, it was actually, I mentioned before the state election policies that came out of Victoria back in the 2000s when there were specific pro-shooting policies. And this is actually something that comes from, as I said, the CLP through Gerard Maley. Now, Gerard Maley is the deputy leader of the CLP, and he's quite a shooter himself. In fact, Nigel, I'm sure you better confirm, he's an ABCDH license holder, I think. He's into pig hunting and goose hunting, so he's quite a he's certainly one of the few politicians I think you're going to find who's very much on our side. So here is the policy. And I'm just going to change that view. Okay, so I just can't read. I'm not sure what those boxes are doing at the top there, but I'm going to read anyway. Basically, there are 5 points, which the first few relate to hunting, as in the reserves that the CLP will commit to, some funding for local hunting organisations to help with conservation efforts. There's a magpie goose management plan and waterfowl limits, which will be locked in for 5 years going forward. Anybody who's into waterfowl shooting will know that there are political games being played around, when the season starts, when it ends, and what you take is, so they're being hardwired in, or they're part of the CLP's platform. The other thing that is there is that really grabs my interest. There are 4 points relating to legislative change. And I'm sorry, I think part of it might be blocked out for you, but there are 3 of them that relate to the availability of ammunition. And some people might recall that there was recently an issue with the ability to sell ammunition in Northern Territory to interstate licence holders, and I understand that was because of the way that the Northern Territory Firearms Act was interpreted. So the first 3 points relate to the availability of ammunition. And the fourth one is, I'll read it, the renewal of current NT firearm licences. The NT Firearms Act actually states that licences cannot be renewed and that you must make a full new application for a licence every 5 years. So that's the policy platform going forward into the NT election, and I might just stop there on that. Now, obviously, I can't speak for Gerard because he's not here, and but maybe Nigel, you might have some observations on that.
Yes, thanks very much, Neil. Look, I think it is very useful to ensure that any political challenge at any election is that the parties are forced to a position where they have to actually have a policy. Sometimes they'd rather not get involved. So on this occasion, I can say I think at the moment that the Labor Party is about to, if they haven't already, pretty much matched what the Country Liberal Party have been put forward. So what the Country Liberal Party have achieved, simply by putting out a comprehensive policy, and they were asked to put out a comprehensive policy. They were asked questions, what do you want to do? And I think it is really important. I note that SSAA in the past in some of the elections have actually published, listen, we're writing to all the parties. We're asking them the same consistent questions, and we're asking them to provide the answers, and we're going to publish the answers. That's very, very useful, particularly when we're underpinning some of the points that have been made about actually asking people to vote a particular way, because if you don't, there's going to be an impact. You're standing on the wall. They're doing nasty things to people on the wall. You're in the line. The line's getting shorter. And it sort of, I think it is really important that political parties are questioned on this rather than letting it sort of go through to the keeper. They don't really have a policy. I think in any event, the issues with the Northern Territory, some of those other matters have been resolved. And I think that it is an issue for lifestyle in the Northern Territory. There's not a lot of us there, but we do like getting out and about a bit. And so issues like fishing and hunting are serious issues that the government takes very seriously, and probably not as much or more so in the Northern Territory than other places. But it is very important that organisations like SSAA continue to do the great work that they do by ensuring that people have an understanding about what the policies are for the people they're voting for.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to... Okay, send it off. Okay, so thank you for that, Nigel. And I think question if there's anybody else who'd like to raise anything. I'd like to welcome Senator Bridget McKenzie, who's here today. So I've got you on mute at the moment, and her timing is impeccable because she's actually got the next presentation. So good afternoon, Bridget. How are you?
Great to be with you. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Everybody? Excellent. Thank you. I'm down in Hamilton in Western Victoria at an event called Sheepvention, which is obviously a convention about sheep, but it's a pretty awesome day, big field day.
What I'll do,
yes.
so I'll just introduce your title. So Senator McKenzie's title is presentation is what shooters can do to improve their outlook, and I'm just going to just introduce you. So Bridget is the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development and the leader of the Nationals in the Senate. She's a former Cabinet Minister and the first federal female Agriculture Minister, and has held a number of portfolios including Emergency Management, National Recovery and Resilience, Sport, Regional Communications, Education and Health. Bridget was elected as Senator for Victoria in 2010, and she holds a Bachelor for Applied Science and Education, specialising in mathematics and physical education, and has lectured at Monash University. And she's the author of a biography of former Country Party Prime Minister John McEwen, Right Man, Right Place, Right Time, and you're quite a shooter yourself. So thanks for joining us, and the floor's yours.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be with you all, and I just want to congratulate you for organising something that I think all of us in all of our different spaces and places have been waiting for, and that's to get one united kind of conversation, shall we say, in this federated space and place that favours law-abiding firearm owners and what we need to do. You know, what we like to do has economic benefits, has social benefits, has environmental benefits. And I don't think we should ever stop promoting that as part of what each of us does in our own space. A big shout out to my former boss, Nigel Scullion. Good to see you, Nige, and former colleague, David Leyonhjelm. Lovely to see you. Long time no see. I guess the way I can probably contribute best to this conversation is just to give you a little bit of my experience over the last 14 years in Parliament. Things that have worked, things that haven't worked, because I know you've been hearing from a raft of guest speakers who are much better and much more experienced than I am in their field of endeavour, so including probably shooting, but I do enjoy it. And I might say when I did Kitchen Cabinet, now a lot of you won't watch the ABC, but Kitchen Cabinet is an ABC show where Annabelle Crabb gets pollies and does amazing things with them. With Nigel, they took him mud crabbing, and when she rang me up, she said, Bridget, I really want to go shooting. I really want to do shooting with you. And I said, well, Annabelle, I don't think the ABC audience is ready for deer hunting and venison backstrap carpaccio as the dish du jour on Kitchen Cabinet. And to her credit, she laughed. She is a country girl, and she said, no, we can't do Bambi. but can we do clays? And to her credit, she couldn't wait. She loved it. And if I'm at the airport, at Sheepfenton, in the shopping centre, and people, that's the most recognised thing. They remember me shooting with Annabelle Crabb, who they love. So it is about taking those moments in all of our professional lives to demystify hunting and shooting, to normalise hunting and shooting, and to normalise hunters and shooters in the eyes of the broader Australian public. Yes, we have, there's a militancy, there's a political arm, etc., that has to be employed. But that social licence to be militant, to be political, also has to come with a legitimacy. And that legitimacy in a democracy like ours comes from people accepting that you have a right and a privilege to do what we want to do. And so I think part of that is normalising and demystifying. And I've tried to take that mindset into everything I've done or tried to do in my political career around firearm ownership and furthering our cause. Because once we lose that, it then becomes very easy, if you're the demonised, it becomes very easy for political forces to separate you from Joe Citizen, from the broader body politic, and therefore you're abnormal, and we can do things to that group over there that we would never do to this group over here. And so that's why I want to keep us as part of the mainstream as much as possible. And that's why Penny winning a bronze, Olympics are great for us because they are part of that broader Australian narrative. One of the things I was able to do in Parliament was to set up the Parliamentary Friends of Shooters, a bipartisan group, and David was a member of that group when he was in the Senate, as was Nigel. And it continues to this day. So Dan Rapaccioli is my co-chair. He's obviously a sporting pistol shooter. And that is a great way for media to understand who we are, because we have an annual police shoot against the media. They come out to a clay range, they meet us all, they have a go, they realise it's not as crazy as they thought it was, and shooters are actually quite normal people. And so the next time they're asked to do a story about a shooting or, something particularly from the left-wing part of our country, they have a better lens on which to analyse the data and to speak to the community. And so that's been a really powerful piece, and I've noticed a change in the media out of Canberra reporting on firearms and firearm owners over the decade. So I would be recommending to anyone, and I don't have an understanding of who's on the Zoom, but if you're involved in state politics, my ideal would be that we would have a Parliamentary Friends of Shooters in every single state and territory, and that we would have a convention or a biannual convention, similar to what they do in the US with the Sportsman's Caucus, which becomes a caucus where we share intelligence and understanding, not just about the activity itself, but legislation across state and federal spheres that can impact our ability to do that. So just an example, when I was Minister for Regional Communications in the last government, Australia Post decided they weren't going to allow certain businesses to post packages of certain sizes and dimensions, which meant that Australian shooters wouldn't be able to actually receive their firearms or their ammunition via Australia Post. And FedEx had refused to do it as well. So we actually had a situation where you were asking people, say, from WA or the Territory or Queensland to drive 7 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours to their nearest capital city to pick it up. So being able to find those pieces of legislation, call the CEO in, do the round table, set up the conversation with business and actually affect change that way. That only comes when you've got MPs from all sides of politics and in all levels of government who are prepared to share the information and who are plugged into stakeholders who are going to go, hey, Bridget, I only knew about that because, you know, farmers from WA got really aggro about it and called me and said, you know, this is going to be an animal husbandry issue for me because I can't actually have the ammo and the firearms I need to actually care for my livestock in a way that's humane. And then obviously all those other flow-on impacts. So I would like to see something like that set up. I've also been asked to speak about how I think we can move things forward. And I think WA has got some really draconian legislation in front of it at the moment at a state level. And unfortunately, both the major parties are backing it. It's only the National Party and minor parties in WA who are saying no to those changes. And that tells me we've got a way to go in normalising the conversation about what law-abiding firearm owners need to do our thing. So we've got to fight against that. And I noticed someone said, oh, we don't want to be political. Sorry, I'm over that. That is, I won't use all the adjectives I was going to use. You know, life is political. Every single decision you make that, you know, that someone doesn't agree with is a political decision. And you've assessed the cost-benefit analysis of that before you make the decision, before you articulate that publicly. We need to be braver, more courageous, more secure in who we are and our genuine need to exist. You can't be celebrating women with gold medals around their necks and the very next minute stopping the clubhouses where that next generation of athlete is grown in every little country town around the country operating. You don't grow Olympic athletes once they turn 18. There's no sport that does that. So there's a whole kind of cascading impact of decisions that seem inconsequential over here that result in significant impacts here. So times of the Olympics, I think, are times that as an industry, I'll call us an industry, I don't know what we're going to call it, a community, that whether you're into it or not, you're going to have to start celebrating it and normalising it because that's the in. It's the in to young people, it's the in to funding, it's the in to legitimising, and it's the in to women. It's the in to women. Now, I don't know how long, I'm a senator, so I can go for 20 minutes without a breath, but if you'd like to go to questions, I'm really happy to. It's often the best way to get the most out of a conversation.
Okay, so again, I'm just trying to organise a couple of things. Okay, if anybody's got any questions or comments to the Senator's speech, then feel free.
I'm always good for a comment or a question, Neil. Interesting, you mentioned a caucus, Bridget. Neil and David put this together, and obviously we as Shooters Union came out quickly in supporting a concept of a national conference. And Tom from SSAA's been speaking about exactly this same kind. I don't know whether you saw some of the material we spoke about earlier, but it's funny, there's a common thread here. We're all speaking the same language. Is something like a national conference that we're starting now that we hope to build into being a venue-based conference, perhaps at the back end of a gun show in Brisbane or
Shot
Melbourne?
show. I was just going to say it'd be perfect at the front or the end or during a shot show. Absolutely.
Correct. And so that's what you were referring to as something like that.
Well, yeah. So
this is what we're hoping to build toward.
I suspect.
No, sorry, I was going to say this is what we're hoping to build towards.
Yeah, David, I cannot say that enough. Like getting CIFA started was critical. Instead of competing against each other, those lads had to come together, and getting them in a room and saying, I'm from government, I'm a shooter. You can't all come to me separately. You need to get together. And they they formulated, and that has been a critical underpinning, I think, for a lot of the work we do. I will just put it out there, like I have always been bedeviled about the fact that I will go into a country town and there'll be a ACA target range, there'll be a field and game target range, there'll be a SSAA target range, an old mate who doesn't get along with any of those other men, he'll have his own off the record out in the back paddock. Like, there is something unique about shooting that someone has a fight with someone in the 1970s and goes and sets up the same thing just down the road. That's got to end. And you don't want that culture. That's probably the culture that's kept everyone separated over a long time. And that's allowed them to pick us off. So I think coming together despite differences, and that's why I think the idea of a caucus is better, because it's not a political party per se. And it is finding political situations and talking about a political construct and political solutions without a singular ideology.
Bridget, I should just introduce myself. Hello, I'm Tom Kenyon. I'm a
Hi, Tom.
state member of Parliament in South Australia, and now for 2.5 weeks now the CEO of SSAA. So really just to say hello. I very much enjoyed your talk just now, and that what you just said about coming together as, you know, with one message at least, if not one group, is a very good news. Well, it's a good message to be giving to the firearms industry more generally.
And I think it's super possible, right? We're well resourced. We're just got to not let the fact that there's a lot of chiefs get in way of the actual message, which is to legitimise, because the social licence is being taken away. You know, firearm owners shop, you know, you can't get finance. They'll be stopping you being able to open new clubs. Hunting is getting more and more restricted. You know, in my own home state, and I hate to say this, but if it wasn't for certain heavies in the Labor Party, we'd be unable to have a duck season. So, I mean, this is the reality that we have to deal with. So getting mums and dads and kids on board, talking about organically, sustainably harvested protein, and sporting clubs, just like your netball club, is what your local shooting club should be, I think. And obviously having the backroom muscle then to do the heavy hitting when you need to have it done. I think that's a good model. But a caucus that is cross parliaments, I think, would be really, really powerful, because the legislation that binds a lot of the issues is at a state level, not at a Commonwealth level.
Well, I'm sure that one of your former colleagues might have something to say.
So one of the issues that I found very disheartening when I was in the Senate with Bridget was how difficult it was to get the consultative committee up and running. Even at the federal level, hearing the government needed to hear from shooters. It needed to hear from the dealers and those trying to import firearm parts and ammunition and firearms themselves. But also there were a multitude of issues, from appearances to categorizations of firearms and all the sorts of things that you're familiar with. And yet I found it extremely frustrating that under the Abbott-Turnbull government, during the time when I was in the Senate, we basically didn't get the consultative committee up and functioning at all. And and that was despite the fact that, at least for part of the time, the relevant minister was in the Senate, in Linda Reynolds. So I found that quite discouraging. And I don't think, I mean, you know, I try not to be pessimistic about this, but it certainly doesn't encourage anybody to think that we're making any progress when even at a basic talking to government level, it doesn't happen. Any thoughts on that, Bridget?
Yeah, David, thank you. My understanding is the Consultative Committee did get up and going, because I sat down with the Minister and said, you can't have that group, you've got to have that group. And we actually had, rather than people, had organisations being a part of that. The problem was, as I understood it, was that it wasn't solidified appropriately, and so dissolved. That it doesn't exist now. So it just completely dissolved. I was of the understanding that it was set up. Field and Game were on it, SSAA was on it, CIFA was on it, the dealers were on it.
So my understanding was that it was eventually set up, but it met about twice and it achieved sod all. So, we might both be right, but...
well, we might both be right, which can also be true.
But I mean, I guess the hope would be that a consultative committee like that might be listened to, taken notice of, and there was no evidence that that was ever the case.
Well, and I think you're right, David. It has to be permanent, not something that a given minister can, at their whim, decide to listen to, hold meetings sometimes. And as I recall, it was people were being sent down rabbit holes on who were making the decisions around things that weren't actually the case. So a proper structure around having a consultative committee to whoever that minister happens to be, and it's usually an assistant minister in the Home Affairs portfolio. I think that's something that this group, outside of me, but hopefully we're in government, can implement it, is actually part of a policy platform that a caucus would put to, as Nigel was saying, all sides of politics, and saying we want a permanent consultative committee at a federal level. We want, what are the high order principles that we can all agree on that don't get into a level of granularity that mean we all disintegrate, but that there's 2 or 3 things that are non-negotiables. Would be, I think, you've got a federal election coming up. You'll have a WA election next year. You've got a Queensland election very, very shortly. But whether there's something that a caucus could sort of agree on. Because at a bare minimum, consultative committees should exist. And the minister should have to meet with X amount of times. It should be a formulated process of feedback and input.
Yes, I quite agree.
Could I just speak to the success we've had in Queensland, Bridget? This may not be the perfect solution, but for many years we had police ministers up here that were, let's just go suboptimal. Mark Ryan came along.
Oh, yeah.
And Mark is on the sort of the left end of the spectrum. He's a lawyer, so he sort of gets law. I knew him personally as he was a patron of a pistol club that I was a member of for a period of time. So I got to meet him through that experience. And when he became police minister, the first thing we did was fire in and go, come on, we want some proper consultation. To his credit, and, we could pick on him for a lot of things, but to his credit, he has been consultative, not listening as much, or maybe the police don't listen as much as they should. But we do have a forum and we do meet reasonably regularly 2 to 3 times a year. And this has been going on for a few years. So it certainly works. And apart from anything else, it also gets us and the Dealers Association and SSAA and a few other interest groups. We're all in the same room.
That's right.
If they're telling porky pies, we all get to hear it, and then we can all go away and, combat it for the next meeting. So I would encourage other states, and look, we're starting to do it a bit in New South Wales. I know SSAA in some states are stronger than others. Certainly up here, they're very active alongside us. Certainly in South Australia, we've got some good representation going on down there, and obviously Tom's from South Australia, so I'm hoping that maybe some of the other states can actually learn from what we've been doing up here. We'd like to make it more productive, of course, but yeah, I think you've got to get everybody at the table and make sure that it is an ongoing thing. So whether we get another, what's his name, Stephen Miles-led government, Lord help us, in the future, or we get a LNP, KAP, crossbench balance of power type government, which would be excellent. We want to keep that process going with the next minister, and I think that suggestion is something that we could all take away into every other state jurisdiction.
It reinforces Bridget's point that this needs to be entrenched, embedded, I can't remember the word she used. The point is, of course, that with the change of minister in Queensland, you might lose all of that. And that's the risk. And that was certainly the situation in the federal arena when ministers were coming and going. The committee would start to get established, and then a minister would change, and then the committee would disappear. It needs to be embedded in the system so that it's not subject to changes in personnel.
Yeah, well, to that end, I mean, we're obviously working on the potential other minister, the future minister, if he becomes it, so that does continue. So yes, you've got to work with both sides of politics. And, I'm pretty apolitical. If Mark Ryan came out and said, we're going to adopt a whole new raft of laws and regulations that Shooters Union are really, really happy with, I'd be saying vote one, Mark Ryan.
Yeah.
I don't care what party you're from. This is a bit more. This is a more single issue matter, which I think we've all spoken to today. Anyway, I should be quiet for a bit.
All right. I think on that score, we'll call this one to an end. Now, I'm going to just move things around a little bit from the agenda because I'm conscious that Senator McKenzie may have something she has to attend to.
No, I've left
okay?
seat mention. I'm on till the close. I'm on till stumps.
Well, saying cool, it gives me a cue to actually introduce our next speaker, who is Jake McCoull. And Jake is the Director of Ground Station Maintenance and Media Director at Sharpshooter Imaging. He has a background in public policy and over 12 years as a sporting shooter. He has a keen interest in historical firearms and World War II militaria. And politically active, Jake has run as a Libertarian Party candidate in multiple WA state elections and is the current president of the WA State Executive. And Jake, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, Neil. It's an honour to address you all today at the National Gun Conference. As Neil said, my name is Jake McCoull. I'm president of the WA State Executive of the Libertarian Party. I've got a passion for technology and advocacy, but most importantly, I'm passionate about sport shooting and a staunch supporter of the rights of firearm owners. Look, I've been a sporting shooter for many years, had a keen interest in historical firearms and World War II militaria. I believe that hunting, shooting sports and responsible firearm ownership should be promoted and encouraged in Australia. I believe the hundreds and thousands of licensed firearm owners are a net benefit to our society. These include farmers who provide our food, hunters who source their own food sustainably, and competition shooters who represent their state and their nation. We should all be promoting these people. However, the media and the government are actively demonising these same people often. On April 14th, we hosted the WA Firearms Bill Roundtable. This was an opportunity for us to address the WA Labor government's Firearms Bill, which had overlooked key findings from the 2016 Project 105 Law Reform Commission report. Our discussions highlighted critical issues and ensured that the perspectives of firearm owners were heard. We had a great lineup of speakers, such as Dr. Augusto Zimmerman, the former Law Reform Commissioner of WA, Lance French of SGS Industries, Ralph Foley of Conservation Australia, and Shooters Union WA representative Steve Harrison. Looking ahead, we're preparing to lead the WA Libertarian Party into the next year's state and federal election. We need to provide a strong, articulate voice for firearm owners and advocate for rational, evidence-based firearm legislation, much like David Leyonhjelm was discussing earlier, while upholding the libertarian values of individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. You might ask, what can firearm owners and supporters do? My answer to that is the 5 following points. Number 1, get informed. Keep up to date with the laws and regulations affecting our rights. Participate in discussions and forums like this. The e-petition against the Labor government's firearms bill had received over 32,000 signatures, making it the most signed e-petition in Western Australia's history. Number 2, take a closer look at all the political parties. Look beyond superficial gestures and focus on federal and state policies and principles on firearm ownership. Does this party have consistency in their values? Question if their support is conditional and easily swayed by special interest groups. Number 3, become an advocate. Volunteer and engage with your networks. Use social media, support those advocating for your rights, engage with local representatives and policymakers to ensure our voices are heard. Number 4, set high standards. Demonstrate responsible firearm ownership through safe practices, proper storage, and setting high standards for yourself and for others. Number 5, join the community. Connect with fellow firearm owners and advocacy groups. A united community is more effective in driving change and defending our rights, much like was discussed by the other speakers here today. Together, we can make a meaningful impact. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you for that, Jake. And it was interesting because we brought you along because we needed representation from WA in light of everything that's happened there. And I think I've been looking at a article from an ABC paper over there, which to illustrate what the problem is, there was a forum that the Nationals also held. I saw your forum, which was really good because it actually allowed a lot of the issues concerned to be tabled. The WA Nationals forum in the Goldfields actually resulted in the Police Minister, Hoplophobe, coming out and basically saying, there's nothing to see here. There's been a long consultation process. We've been consulting since 2014. There's been a committee in the upper house that's helped inform the bill, and they helped to rewrite the acts. That process was 2.5 years. There's been town hall meetings with firearm clubs and police. There was nothing to see here. That's rather extraordinary, and that's why I'm interested to get your perspective on what you've seen.
My understanding is that they've communicated that they have had these discussions, but I have strong doubts about how much communication actually took place. I've spoken to some of the representatives as quoted by the police minister that they've consulted with, and sometimes they're talking about just an email, pretty stock standard template type of an email, and they consider that as lengthy consultation.
It wasn't even that kind. I mean, I'm going to open this up in a minute to others, but I think everybody around here has seen sort of what's happened in WA, and the consultation was one way. We couldn't even get an extension on the consultation, submission date. I think it was out for 4 weeks or something. So, yeah, no, thank you for that. Is there anybody else who would like to comment, ask a question?
I wouldn't mind it because I met with some of the organisers. I've been over to the WA SHOT Show. I'm very aware of the issues. I think you're dead right, Jake, about having to get political on this case. There's, I think, 83,000 law-abiding firearm owners in Western Australia. Many of them are in the southwest of Perth, obviously in the regions, but in terms of making a political impact, getting some targeted, a bit like what I've been at Sheepfence, and WA's over here with the Keep the Sheep group, for instance, and it's had a wonderfully successful social media campaign that's really galvanised the Western Australian community about an industry that's being shut down. Similar thing concerns with the law-abiding firearm owners in WA, a way to tap in a similar community way and activating those 83,000 voters heading into, is it March next year, Jake?
That's correct, March.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of mischief you can make in that period of time, as long as you don't spread yourself too thin, both people power, but on your message. Because we can all get into the weeds on technicalities very easily, and then the public's eyes glaze over. So it's about, and the Keep the Sheep campaign's kind of a way that they've been able to humanise. Again, the live sheep export trade isn't something most people know about, care about, want to know about, similar for us. So that there just might be some lessons to learn for the WA community there. And have you thought about how to activate those 83,000?
Certainly, I think there's definitely a need to activate those members. I think there has been somewhat activation. As I mentioned earlier, there was at least 32,000 signatures on that e-petition in Western Australia, making it the most signed e-petition in Western Australia's history. So I think the shooters here are definitely becoming activated, and we need to keep up that uptick in motivation, political motivation in the shooters here. I believe there's a lot of groups here that are helping with this as well. WAFCA, I think, was mentioned earlier as well. And we all need to band together, much like we've discussed with the other speakers here today.
Okay, look, Jake, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate getting the view of one of the political parties that will be contesting the next WA state election in March. I'm going to skip forward on the agenda a little bit to go to an award that we're going to be presenting at every gun conference going forward, and that's called the Hoplophobe of the Year Award. The word hoplophobe is a real word, and it was actually nominated by David Leyonhjelm. So, David, if you could just quickly explain what the word means, that'd be greatly appreciated.
So hoplophobe was a word that was first coined by a guy called Jeff Cooper, who is famous in America for his advocacy of gun ownership and also his training of practical gun ownership, self-defense, which is a whole other issue that we haven't touched on today. And he described people who don't like guns, and I discussed them in my presentation at the beginning of this conference today. But it's really not about rational reasons why people don't like guns. It's an emotional feeling. And it's a feeling. And so he coined the term hoplophobe. A phobe is an aversion to something, and hopla has some Greek roots relating to firearms, as I recall. So that's the origin of it, and it's been picked up and used quite a lot in the time since Jeff Cooper first mooted it. But I don't think, well, I'm not sure how woke the psychologists and psychiatrists are. The non-woke ones probably do use it, but they're not all non-woke, obviously.
Sure. Thank you. And of course, we actually do have the award here. In fact, I'm going to turn my background off because you won't be able to see it. Okay, I'm just going to hold it up here. So basically, here it is, and it's blurred. I can see.
Hold beside your face.
In front of my face.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is the award. It's actually quite a decent weight in it. It's quite impressive. So this was we had considered a number of candidates, including politicians who were responsible for a bolt action shotgun ban in Victoria. Actually, it's a restriction, a bit like the Lever action, on the basis of opportunistic misuse, a new policy platform for banning guns in Victoria. The move to make life harder for antique dealers in Tasmania, the proposed restrictions in Queensland, and the restriction on ammo sales in the Northern Territory, which has been reversed. However, the shining star has been without doubt WA's Police Minister Paul Papadia. So congratulations, Paul. For that, we have actually written to him, and we invited him to today to accept the award, but he hasn't. So I'll be mailing that off to him tomorrow. So he's the for bringing checks on the number of firearms you can own, increasing your own power to determine what firearm categories are, and also what targets you can shoot at a range. And also just other stuff that's happening at the moment with license being revoked and ranges being shut down because of new templates that are coming into effect. So that's why the award is going to Papadia. Right. So that is the end of pretty much the presentations, and I'm going to open up the floor to the panel to see if there's any questions, other issues from today that anybody would like to ask or comment on. Because we do have a Q&A session to follow.
I think we just get straight into that, Neil.
I say we get to the Q&A.
I think we're getting tired. I've got a question here. I don't know if the panel members can see it. This is about the US Supreme Court overturning a ban on bump action stocks by the ATF, for which is basically using its unilateral status as a bureaucracy, has turned lawful firearm owners into felons. And is there a chance the Australian government, government entities like Border Force, the Department of Home Affairs and various police and regulatory bodies could be held to the same standard by the courts? I think is what the question is.
Neil, it come as no surprise that I'm sort of across this, obviously because of my relationship with Tom Gresham in the US. This was not just a court case relating to bump stocks. That was just the thing that motivated a case where multiple government organisations, in this case the ATF, but also ones that look after environment and what have you, making up rules that became punishable by, you know, in this case, federal offences. You became a federal felon, risk time in club fed, and they were able to just do this with no supervision, no, these things didn't have to go to Congress. So the point of this case was, no, you've got to stop criminalising people. If you want to make this a law, put it to Parliament, or in their case, put it to Congress and let Congress decide, because that's the way our government should work. The people elect the congressmen and women, and they make the decision. So this is very much a similar problem we're seeing right now. I'm seeing it in Queensland. We've seen it in Western Australia, where even police departments will take an act and a bunch of supporting regulations and then go and make up their own policies, and then you get policed on the policies, not on the Firearm Act. So I'd be interested in Bridget and David Leyonhjelm's and Nigel's view on that, because that's a problem we are having here in Australia as well.
Yeah, David, I'll just go quickly first. I absolutely, you've got the Act, and increasingly, not just in this area of legislation, but across the board, governments, to avoid scrutiny and avoid having to go back to what can sometimes be quite problematic senates, resort to regulation rather than legislation. Having been a former minister, can we do that by regulation? Because if we can, let's go down that route. You say to your department, rather than legislation, because then at least you know you can get it, whatever you're wanting to do, through. So that is absolutely an issue, the increasing propensity of, and I'm assuming that's happening at state level too. There are mechanisms within our parliament. We have a Senate committee that is actually tasked with looking at regulations and under ministerial direction to see if they fit a certain set of standards. But again, it can become quite a political space, and it doesn't probably function as the people that the senators that set it up thought it would. And then you have that third issue, which is the interpretation and implementation of any given regulatory framework. And so then you've got even another 2 levels under the Parliament's work and the Minister's work, where this can be looking very different on the ground than even the Minister or the Parliament ever envisaged it was going to be enacted. So I think it is an issue. It's an issue of transparency and accountability through the system. I'm not sure how to fix it. And so David and Nigel, I'm going to kick that one, the how, now that you're on the outside, how, you know, I see that as there's sort of 4 stratospheres: the legislation, the regulation, then there's the interpretation of that and the implementation. And those 2 are where it's interfacing with people.
And that's where the problem is. You're
yeah, exactly.
It's the we'll make up a policy and nab them with the regulation and
and there's no squaring back up against the regulation or the minister or the bureaucracy, or you know, that those the 2 kind of instigators, shall we say, of that process.
So we had an example of that, not on a firearms related issue, but with the e-safety commissioner, Julian Grant, trying to tell X, Twitter, to take down worldwide a video of that priest or whatever he was in Sydney being stabbed. The whole world had seen it, but she took it on herself, claiming she had legislative authority to order X to take it down worldwide. X is well funded, and so they went off to the court and said, we don't think they've got authority to do that, and the court agreed. There's and that was a nice thing to see, that a bureaucrat had her wings clipped, but it's still applied to Australian forums. So she's basically says she has the authority to decide what is disinformation and misinformation, and to order it to be taken down under penalty of fine for refusing to do it. And unless you're willing to take it to court and fight them, as X did, as Musk's did, then you know, you've got a problem. So I don't know what the answer is either, though, Bridget, because the problem is that going to the courts, the judges are only too happy. Yeah, the judges are only too happy to think they know better than the Parliament does. Ultimately, it should be the Parliament that's quite specific about what those powers should be used for, if they should be used at all, or even if they should exist at all. I would argue there's no role for an e-safety commissioner, full stop. But if you think there is one, that should be very, very carefully circumscribed. And that's Parliament's job. Now, Parliament is a fractious environment, as we all know, and getting the outcomes that governments want, ministers want through Parliament it's tortuous. And, you know, there's, as the saying goes, it's like making sausages. It's best if you don't watch the process.
That's right.
Just look at the end result. I don't know what the answer is, other than for those in Parliament to be on the case. And in the case of the Senate, that case is frantic speed. You just really are so damn busy. There's so much going on that, you know, the forensic detail you need to be alert to that sort of thing is really, really challenging.
Yeah. Nigel?
Yeah, look, if I can just make a couple of points. First of all, in a federal position, regulation is in fact a disallowable instrument. It gives us an opportunity to bring it back to Parliament. It only needs one person to disallow it. And happens is that you provide at least an argument to go there. But I think we need to be a bit fair dinkum and realise that this level is not going to be at a federal level. The states and territories are those ones, like West Australia, who actually administer it and legislation as it works in a state and territory government setting that will have to be across. So West Australia, for example, the vast majority of the regulation has not been written. Now, both David and Bridget would know where there are issues that affect a lot of people without hoping that there'll be some input.
Okay, sorry, Nigel. In fact, I might, your signal strength has actually just improved a little bit, so we'll just, if you can just continue that, or try to continue it.
Okay, look, so the point I was going to get to is that at the state and territory level, when it comes to firearms regulations, the parliamentary process is one thing, and it's painful enough, but it's the police that are making the final determination. Yes. And so we need to look to administrative appeal tribunals, and the West Australian Commissioner has actually stood up and has provided a sort of a bit of a spray of not all that happy with them, simply because they have gone against, they have actually been appealed, and the appeals have been run through the Administration Appeal Tribunal. They're subject, like most judicial systems, to the notion of a precedent. That's why I mentioned in my earlier contribution that it is important that our general industry support those precedential or test cases with the administration tribunals, in so much as we can provide legal assistance, we can provide riders, however we do it, because as those issues come to bear, that's actually the process that's going to have as much impact as anything can have, probably more impact than the impact of regulation in Parliament.
Tom is a former politician and in a state parliament as well. What are your thoughts, Tom?
I just think, just firstly commenting on those, I think part of the answer is the various shooter groups setting up some form of fund or funds that will be prepared to fund some of these, administrative appeal tribunal cases, some of the legal cases, just to push back. It means the police will just get away with whatever they can, right? They sort of a law unto themselves in a way, and especially state police. And you just sort of need to push back a bit. Often you'll find, at the state level especially, this is true, is a weak police minister just does what the commissioner tells them, and a lot of damage can be done by a weak police minister because they just sort of follow on from what they're told to do by the commissioner. But I think in some ways, we're at the point where we're going to have to push back some of these things legally, because there is that trend, as you say, of not just regulation, but just interpretation of regulation or policy, and that needs to be pushed back. But the other thing, a friend of mine used to have a question that he always asked when someone told him something, he had to do something, especially relating to firearms, was what part of the Act are you referring to? When you and almost always they could not answer that question.
No, okay.
So.
Tom, I think that's a really good point. Like our farmers groups have their fighting funds, and they've been used for really good purposes over the years to take like significant legal cases that have really been kind of almost the wall for everybody else. Yeah. I think that's an excellent idea.
Yeah, actually, Tom, you and I probably should take this further offline after the conference. We've been doing this in Queensland with QCAT and QPS, and we've had an alarmingly high success rate. And it's often just a case of, yeah, they don't want to lose in QCAT, even though precedence doesn't quite work quite the same there, but they don't like losing, so they roll over the minute you put some pressure on them. So we should talk about that as a cooperative thing between your organisation and ours. but I think other organisations could learn from, you know, our experience here. So should we move to the next question, Neil? Because it's been directed at me and Bridget. If a young bloke from the Central Coast wanted to represent Shooters Union or the Nationals, how could I go about it? Well, I'm going to go and say, first, you need to know what Shooters Union is. We're a lobbying and advocacy organisation. Okay? That's our primary focus. A bit like what we're about today. Sounds to me like you want to represent in the political sphere. So I think the best qualified person right now is Bridget and probably Tom. And, you know, Tom, particularly from being a state representative, how do you go getting involved with one of the parties?
Oh, well, I'm a recovering politician, so I'm out of it now.
Me too.
But if you were stupid enough to want to do it again.
But Bridget might have an interest, seeing that's her party you talked about, so I won't try and talk for her.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, thank you for considering politics. It gets a lot of derision, but it is actually a way that no matter which party you join, you can actually make a real difference for your community and your country, and that's something to always stay front and centre. For the National Party, we're one of the oldest parties. We're over 120 years old, and we're very grassroots. So best way is to join your local branch, make sure you have lots to say, help a lot. It's like joining a club. You want your team to succeed, so you do everything you can as a member of the Nats to help your team succeed. And if you want to become a parliamentarian, then there'll be opportunities along the way to run for pre-selection, which is usually, I think the rules are the same in New South Wales, but the local branch members pick who's going to be their local candidate. So this weekend, we've had a retiring parliamentarian, Mark Colton, up in Parkes, which is sort of Moree and Dubbo and everywhere in between. And all the branch members drove in and heard everybody that were putting their hands up and actually all voted on who they wanted to be their next candidate. And that's the person the Nats will end up putting up at the next election. So can I give you some advice about political parties? Pick one that you like the values of, not just about guns. You've got, like, they're broad churches, and my first essay in politics, my political science class at university, was why political parties are bad for democracy. And David would probably agree, would have given me an A+ for it. I did get a high distinction, but I've come to understand and appreciate that if you can agree with 80 to 90% of a political party's platform, then that's the place for you to hit your political action with, because it is a team sport. So if you're really kind of an individual kind of guy or girl that wants to your way or the highway, a political party might not be your best avenue to get your political views across. But for me, my heart and soul's in the country, and that's why I'm a Nat.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that it be prepared to spend some time. Like, it doesn't happen. If you want to get into Parliament, it's not going to happen quickly. Like, I think it was 15 years between me joining the Labor Party and getting into Parliament. So, you know.
Yeah, same here. Yeah. And I didn't join to become a parliamentarian. It just sort of kind of is one of those things that happens on the journey. So it does take time, because you're asking people to trust you, and they need to know you before they're going to trust you.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think Jake and I've come from a small party background. I think Jake would be familiar with this too. That if you want to stand in a minor party, they'll grab anyone. Sometimes it's not a reflection on your party, Jake. It's probably more of a reflection of my journey. Look, there's actually quite a few other questions that have come in. I'm going to pick one, and then I've just got a couple other things to do, and then we'll probably be done for the day, which is good because we'll be pretty close to the time that we wanted to finish. So this is a question. In America, leaving aside the Second Amendment, the strongest argument for ownership of guns is self-defense. Yet in Australia, it is not legal to carry anything specifically for that purpose. Does a self-defense argument have a future in Australia? So I don't know who would like to deal with that.
Well, it was one of the issues that I pursued when I was in Parliament. And if you look at what has won the argument in America, self-defense has won. The Second Amendment, I don't think would have survived without self-defense being the underlying need, if you like. So the claim the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun resonated with large numbers of people in America. And, America is not the rest of the world. The point I made earlier is there are more than 2 countries in the world, and just because something happens in America doesn't mean it should or shouldn't happen in Australia. There are lots of other places. In the Czech Republic, which I think is a much better country for us to compare ourselves with, self-defense is a justification for owning a gun, and they can have concealed carry and everything. In Switzerland, where gun ownership is very normal, there is a bias against owning guns for self-defense. You can get them for self-defense, but you have to demonstrate a need. So it's not like the Czech Republic or America where you don't have to demonstrate a need. Australia is the only country I'm aware of where you're not allowed to have anything for self-defense, not a pocket knife, not any weapon whatsoever. You're not supposed to carry anything. The only vague exception is Western Australia and pepper spray, and even there, good luck arguing if you get pinged over it. So, and that's really weird. With the possible exception of Japan, and I haven't looked at their laws closely enough for non-firearms. Obviously, they have very strict gun laws, but I haven't looked at their laws for self-defense more broadly. But with that caveat, I'm not aware of any country that says you are a victim. You have to be a victim unless you're a karate expert, or you are carrying something in your pocket or your handbag which you are carrying for another purpose, but just coincidentally you can use it to protect yourself if you get attacked. I don't think the Australian public likes that idea. Certainly there are a lot of people that I know of who strongly disagree with it. And I think it is probably, in terms of rational arguments, and as I emphasised earlier, rational arguments are a bit short on in this space. But in terms of rational arguments, it's the closest that we've got to a winning majority support. And I think it is.
Okay, thank you for that. Would it be one more question, and then I'll close it up. And this is a question for Tom. And actually, the question for Tom. In his role as an organisation representing about 25% of Australian shooters, being a big organisation, you are at the top of the federal body of an organisation that's set up on a federated basis, just like Australia. The state branches operate under their own guises and therefore can have very different views. In the context of what this conference aims to achieve, is it possible to bring their weight to bear in all states?
Yeah, that is one of the things I'm finding, and about the SSAA is that federated model. Thanks, Mick, for the question, by the way. And you're right, the states do have, under that model, the states do have a lot of autonomy about how they operate. So part of my job is to work with my national board to bring firstly the national board on along for the ride, and also then to filter that down through to the states. So it is possible that the states will decide to operate in their own way, and I'm hoping I'm not. Maybe I'll find out if I get a phone call soon. But I'm hoping that I'm not stepping too far out of bounds in my role as national CEO. But that I think this is my view on the future of protecting our sport and the best way to go about doing that. So I would like to bring the states along as well, I think the national board has a sort of a predilection to head in that direction as well, and we'll be trying to do that as best we can. But you know, all of these, I'm rapidly discovering everything to do with firearms is complicated. You know, that there's, you know, I think we've said over 90 organisations, and it's that fractious nature of that Bridget referred to of firearm shooters. It might be something to do with the demographic, the age demographic that seems to dominate firearms. But yeah, we'll have our own challenges internally in the SSAA, as will every organisation, I think, in terms of, you know, just that unity of direction and unity of purpose. But that's what we need to do, in my view.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we're now close to the end of the day. I'm going to move to basically the last, just 2 or 3 very short sections, which I'll do with. And the date of that next conference, which has been set, is Sunday the 3rd of August 2025. So get that into your diaries, and you can actually find out more about that by joining the email list of Shooters Union and Politics Reloaded. And you can find out more about our sponsors at the websites on your screen. You can join our email list, you can become a member, you can donate to our causes. And just finally, if I just go to this next one, if you run a shooting related business or organisation, then you can join this, get behind this next conference and have your logo up there to show your support. So hop on board for the next National Gun Conference, and you can contact us at the email address that you see on our screen. And just going back, David, you've got a book coming out, or you've got another book in the works, so if you could just let us know a bit more about it, that would be great.
Okay, so my first book was written primarily for Australians. It was explaining to Australians what the gun laws are in Australia, what they're all about, how they came into effect, and and what they mean basically for shooters. And then there were some chapters written by people who were invited to contribute about the gun laws in their own countries. So there's England, New Zealand, India, Czech Republic, Switzerland. And then I did the chapter on American gun laws myself. What I discovered, though, was that the Americans are not very interested in anything that happens outside America, and so the book didn't get picked up there. And also, what was missing from it was a sort of a philosophical underpinning. When we talk about gun laws, we say, well, what are you trying to achieve? If you talk to somebody in government, whether they're in policy or they're in Parliament, what are you trying to achieve? How would you measure the success of your approach? You want to change the gun laws? If we said to Paul Papalia, for example, with his laws in Western Australia, how will you know whether what you have done is a good thing? How would you measure that? And the chances are he won't have an answer. He might say, well, there might be fewer shootings. Well, fewer than what? They said that about John Howard's gun laws in 1997 and 2002. Except, as we know, the rate of gun deaths continued to decline at precisely the same rate as they did before John Howard's gun laws. What else? What other measure might there be? Well, people might feel safer. And how would you measure that? And so you get into a philosophical discussion about what actually are you trying to achieve. We don't have that kind of underpinning in Australia for our gun laws. They are an absolute shambles in philosophical terms. You could not go to any of the state governments, any of the gun control advocacy groups, and say, how would you measure the success of your approach to gun control? You couldn't do it. So this book that I'm now writing is intended to look at the whole issue more broadly. It's looking at genocides. It's looking at in other words, the negative effect of gun control. From the Nazis and their gun control laws prohibiting the Jews from having guns, through to Rwanda, Pol Pot's regime, all those sort of things, which were all accompanied by very stringent gun control, down to what's happening in Australia. Are we achieving anything by our attitudes to gun control? And we know what the answer is, but nobody's ever spelt it out properly before. And that's my aim, is to spell it out.
Sure. Okay, look, thank you for that. And unless anybody else has any questions or anything else to say?
I'd just like to, if I can, Neil, there's one thing that has irked me for many, many years, and it's a part of the environment under which we operate. We think for a moment it is quite surprising that it is allowed to be a part of this process. And that's the role that police play in firearm reform. They have an acknowledged and stated position that is anti-firearm. That we want less shooters, we want less firearms. And yet they are in the very centre. Every committee, every decision, all the discretion is down to the police. And yet it has remained, until today, unchallenged. Now, I think it's something that we should consider making part of our narrative about simply challenging it. Why would we have cars that if you don't register your car, or you run into someone, or you do something dreadful with a vehicle, the police attend to it because it's part of the criminal code? In exactly the same way as firearms do. But every firearm, the vehicle registry is run by the Department of Transport. It's just a cool bananas thing. They get the rules, you go out and you do what you need to do with your vehicle. But in firearms, it's the police that are always involved. It's irrational. It really doesn't have a precedent. And yet they have an apprehended position that is a complete bias. They have put that forward themselves. And it's something that I think, in terms of advancing our cause, would need a sophisticated and proper approach, because I believe that if the actual firearms registration and this whole process were managed in the same way we do with other tools that we use, and the police are there for when you actually break the law, we would all be a lot better off.
Yeah, I think you've got half a dozen people here who are absolutely on the same page. Okay, everybody, look, thank you for that. David, Nigel, actually the two Davids, and Nigel and Jake and Tom, Bridget, and everybody else who's joined us today. So thank you for that. Sorry about some of the technical hiccups, but as I said, this is year one, so we're just looking at this as being really to prove the concept. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Neil.
And
Thank
we'll
you,
see you next year.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neil.
Great stuff. Thanks, everyone.